In the deepest recesses of human prehistory, long before the first cities rose from the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, before the great pyramids cast their shadows across the Egyptian desert, before the written word captured the fleeting thoughts of humanity, there existed a profound and mysterious spiritual technology that would shape the very foundations of human consciousness for tens of thousands of years. This technology, born in the flickering firelight of Paleolithic caves and nurtured through countless generations of human experience, would come to be known as shamanism, though its practitioners in those ancient times would have recognized no such term. They knew only that certain individuals among them possessed the extraordinary ability to traverse the boundaries between the visible world of flesh and stone and the invisible realms where spirits dwelt, where the souls of animals congregated, where the forces that governed rain and sun and the movements of great herds could be petitioned, appeased, and occasionally directed toward human purposes. The archaeological evidence for these earliest manifestations of shamanic practice emerges from the geological strata like fragments of a vast spiritual tapestry, each discovery adding new threads to our understanding of how our ancestors first developed the capacity to consciously alter their states of awareness and journey into dimensions of experience that transcended ordinary waking consciousness. Between 45,000 and 30,000 years ago, as anatomically modern humans spread across the continents of Europe and Asia, displacing or absorbing the Neanderthal populations that had preceded them, they carried with them not merely sophisticated tools of stone and bone, not merely advanced techniques for hunting the great megafauna that roamed the Pleistocene landscapes, but something far more remarkable and far more consequential for the future development of human civilization. They carried the seeds of spiritual technologies that would fundamentally transform the relationship between human consciousness and the cosmos, creating frameworks for understanding existence that would persist in modified forms into the present day. The painted caves of southwestern Europe stand as the most spectacular and enduring monuments to this ancient spiritual awakening, their walls adorned with images that speak across millennia to observers who approach them with appropriate reverence and understanding. Lascaux, in the Dordogne region of France, discovered in 1940 by 4 teenagers and their dog, contains some of the most breathtaking examples of Paleolithic art ever found, its galleries decorated with hundreds of animal figures, rendered with a naturalistic precision and artistic sophistication that astonished the modern world when they were first revealed. The great bulls of Lascaux, some measuring over 17 feet in length, parade across the limestone walls with a vitality and presence that suggests their creators understood these images as far more than mere decoration or idle artistic expression. These were sacred representations, portals through which the spiritual essence of the depicted animals could be accessed, honored, and engaged in the complex negotiations that ensured successful hunting and the continued prosperity of human communities. Chauvet Cave in the Ardèche region, discovered in 1994 and subsequently dated to approximately 36,000 years ago, pushed back the timeline of sophisticated cave art by nearly 15,000 years, demonstrating that the artistic and spiritual capabilities of early modern humans were far more ancient and fully developed than scholars had previously imagined. The lions of Chauvet, rendered with extraordinary attention to anatomical detail and behavioral accuracy, stalk across the cave walls in compositions that suggest narrative sequences, perhaps depicting mythological events or shamanic visions that held profound significance for their creators. The cave bears, rhinoceroses, and mammoths that populate these underground galleries represent not merely the fauna of the Pleistocene world, but the spiritual powers that animated that world, the great forces with which human shamanic practitioners had to establish and maintain proper relationships. The famous sorcerer of Trois Frères cave in the French Pyrenees, dated to approximately 15,000 years ago, provides perhaps the clearest and most compelling evidence of shamanic transformation in Paleolithic art. This remarkable figure, engraved and painted on a prominent position overlooking a chamber filled with animal images, depicts a being that combines human and animal characteristics in ways that precisely mirror the shamanic concept of spiritual metamorphosis. The figure possesses the antlers of a great stag, the ears of a wolf, or perhaps a horse, the tail of a horse or wolf, the legs of a human, and the genitalia of a feline, creating a composite entity that embodies the shamanic practitioner's ability to transcend the boundaries between species and assume the powers and perspectives of multiple animal allies simultaneously. The posture of this figure, with its bent knees and forward-leaning stance, suggests ecstatic dance, the rhythmic movement that shamanic practitioners throughout history have employed to induce the altered states of consciousness necessary for spiritual transformation and otherworldly travel. The positioning of the Trois Frères sorcerer is itself significant, located in an elevated niche that would have required considerable effort to reach, and that provides a commanding view of the chamber below. This placement suggests that the figure served as a presiding presence over rituals conducted in the space beneath, perhaps representing a master shaman or shamanic deity who oversaw the spiritual activities of human practitioners. The deliberate difficulty of accessing this location indicates that viewing or interacting with the image was itself a significant act, possibly restricted to initiated individuals who had earned the right to approach such powerful spiritual representations. The combination of human and animal features in this single figure encapsulates the fundamental shamanic understanding that the boundaries between species are permeable, that human consciousness can expand to encompass animal perspectives and powers, and that certain individuals possess the ability to navigate these transformations for the benefit of their communities. Archaeological investigations at Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic have revealed burial sites dating to approximately 26,000 years ago that provide compelling evidence of specialized spiritual practitioners within Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherer communities. The triple burial discovered at this site, containing the remains of 3 individuals arranged in a deliberate and symbolically significant pattern, includes a central figure whose skeletal remains show evidence of physical abnormalities that in many traditional societies would have marked them as possessing special spiritual powers. This individual, possibly female based on skeletal analysis, displayed a pronounced facial asymmetry and other physical characteristics that would have set them apart from their contemporaries, potentially marking them as someone touched by spiritual forces and therefore suited for shamanic roles. The grave goods surrounding this central figure at Dolní Věstonice included an extraordinary array of objects that suggest ritual use and spiritual significance. Carved ivory figurines, including representations of animals and abstract forms, were positioned around the bodies in patterns that indicate deliberate placement, according to symbolic principles that we can only partially reconstruct. Red ochre, the iron-rich pigment that appears consistently in Paleolithic burial contexts throughout Europe and beyond, covered the remains in quantities that suggest its application was a central element of mortuary ritual rather than an incidental addition. Perforated shells, transported from coastal regions hundreds of miles distant, indicate participation in exchange networks that moved not merely material goods, but potentially spiritual knowledge and ceremonial practices across vast geographical distances. The Venus figurines scattered across European archaeological sites from this period reveal another crucial dimension of Paleolithic spiritual practice, one that emphasizes feminine spiritual power and the mysteries of fertility, birth, and regeneration. These carved representations, found from the Pyrenees to the plains of Siberia, display exaggerated feminine features, particularly breasts, hips, and abdomens, that suggest their use in rituals related to fertility, pregnancy, and the continuation of human and animal populations. The Venus of Willendorf, discovered in Austria in 1908 and dated to approximately 28,000 years ago, exemplifies the sophisticated artistic and spiritual sensibilities of these early communities. Her carefully carved coiffure or headdress, her pronounced feminine attributes, and her faceless anonymity all suggest that she represents not a specific individual, but a spiritual principle, a goddess or spirit of fertility whose power could be invoked through proper ritual attention to her carved representation. The widespread distribution of similar figurines across vast geographical distances, from France to Siberia, indicates shared spiritual concepts that transcended local cultural boundaries and suggests the movement of shamanic practitioners or spiritual knowledge between communities separated by thousands of miles. This distribution pattern implies the existence of networks through which spiritual technologies were transmitted, refined, and adapted to local conditions, while maintaining core characteristics that reflected common understandings of feminine spiritual power and its role in ensuring the fertility and prosperity of human communities. The consistency of certain stylistic elements across this vast range suggests that these figurines were not merely local artistic productions, but representations of widely recognized spiritual beings whose worship or veneration formed part of a broadly shared religious tradition. Siberian archaeological sites provide particularly rich evidence of early shamanic practice, offering glimpses into spiritual traditions that would continue to develop in this region for tens of thousands of years, eventually producing the classical shamanic systems that would provide the very terminology through which the modern world understands these ancient practices. At Malta, near Lake Baikal, in south-central Siberia, excavations have revealed a site dating to approximately 24,000 years ago that contained numerous carved figurines representing both animals and humans in various poses, suggesting ritual activity. The mammoth ivory carvings from Malta include representations of women similar to the European Venus figurines, indicating participation in the same broad spiritual tradition, as well as depictions of birds, particularly waterfowl, that may represent early forms of the spirit helpers that would become central to later Siberian shamanic practice. The discovery of bone needles and evidence of sophisticated clothing production at Malta and other Siberian Paleolithic sites suggests that the creation of ritual garments was already an established practice among these ancient communities. The extreme cold of Ice Age Siberia necessitated the development of tailored clothing for physical survival, but the evidence suggests that clothing also served spiritual functions, with certain garments being created specifically for ritual use and decorated with symbols and attachments that enhanced their spiritual potency. This early development of ritual costume traditions would eventually produce the elaborate shamanic regalia documented among historical Siberian peoples, with their hundreds of metal ornaments, animal representations, and cosmic symbols that transformed the wearer into a being capable of traversing the boundaries between worlds. The development of animistic worldviews during the Upper Paleolithic period represents a fundamental transformation in human consciousness, a shift from purely practical engagement with the environment to a recognition that the world was populated by spiritual beings whose cooperation was essential for human survival and prosperity. Unlike the simple tool-making and food-gathering activities that characterized earlier phases of human existence, the Upper Paleolithic witnessed the emergence of complex belief systems that recognized spiritual agency in all aspects of the natural world. Rivers possessed spirits that controlled the movements of fish and the availability of water. Mountains housed powerful beings that influenced weather patterns and provided sanctuary for the souls of the dead. Forests teemed with spiritual entities that governed the behavior of game animals and the growth of plants upon which human communities depended. Individual animals possessed souls that required proper treatment to ensure their continued willingness to provide sustenance for human hunters. This animistic worldview necessitated the development of specialized individuals capable of communicating with these spiritual entities and mediating between the human community and the vast spiritual ecosystem that surrounded and interpenetrated the physical world. These early shamanic practitioners, recognizable in the archaeological record through their distinctive burial practices, their associated artifacts, and the artistic representations that depict their activities, served multiple essential functions within their communities. They acted as healers, using their knowledge of medicinal plants combined with spiritual techniques to treat illnesses that were understood to have supernatural as well as physical causes. They served as weather workers, attempting to influence atmospheric conditions through ritual practices that petitioned or propitiated the spirits controlling rain, snow, wind, and temperature. They functioned as psychopomps, guides who could navigate the geography of the afterlife and ensure that the souls of the deceased reached their proper destinations rather than lingering to trouble the living. Most importantly, these early shamanic practitioners maintained the delicate balance between human communities and the spiritual forces that governed their world, conducting the ongoing negotiations and observing the complex protocols that ensured continued access to the resources upon which human survival depended. Their role extended far beyond purely spiritual functions to encompass practical knowledge that was essential for community prosperity. Archaeological evidence suggests that shamanic practitioners served as keepers of astronomical knowledge, tracking the movements of celestial bodies and the seasonal changes that were crucial for successful hunting, gathering, and eventually agricultural activities. The arrangement of stones and other markers at Paleolithic sites indicates sophisticated understanding of solar and lunar cycles, knowledge that required specialized training to acquire and maintain, and that provided crucial information for timing migrations, predicting animal movements, and coordinating community activities with natural rhythms. Bone flutes discovered at archaeological sites across Europe provide compelling evidence of the central role of music in early shamanic practice, demonstrating that the use of sound to induce altered states of consciousness has roots extending back to the very beginnings of modern human presence in Europe. The flute discovered at Hohlfels Cave in Germany, dated to approximately 43,000 years ago, represents one of the oldest known musical instruments in the world. Crafted from the wing bone of a griffon vulture, this remarkable artifact produces a range of tones that modern researchers have found capable of inducing meditative states and altered consciousness when played in appropriate settings. The choice of material, a bone from a bird associated with death and the consumption of carrion, suggests that the instrument may have been specifically intended for ritual use related to death, transformation, and communication with spiritual realms. Similar instruments discovered at sites across the Swabian Alps region of Germany indicate that musical technology was rapidly developed and disseminated among Upper Paleolithic communities, possibly through networks of shamanic practitioners who recognized the spiritual potential of these sound-producing devices. The acoustic properties of the caves where these instruments were discovered reveal sophisticated understanding of sound and its effects on human consciousness. Many painted caves exhibit remarkable acoustic characteristics, with certain chambers producing strong echoes or resonances at specific frequencies that would have been dramatically enhanced by the playing of bone flutes or the beating of drums. The placement of painted images often corresponds to areas of optimal acoustic effect, suggesting that visual and auditory elements were deliberately combined to create immersive spiritual experiences that engaged multiple senses simultaneously. The integration of multiple consciousness-altering techniques within single ritual contexts represents a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and spiritual experience that was already well developed by the Upper Paleolithic period. Archaeological evidence suggests that drumming, chanting, dancing, fasting, and possibly the consumption of psychoactive substances were combined in carefully orchestrated ceremonies designed to produce specific spiritual effects. The complexity of these practices indicates that shamanic technique had achieved considerable sophistication by this early period, with practitioners possessing detailed knowledge of how different stimuli affected consciousness and how these effects could be combined and directed toward particular spiritual goals. The painted caves themselves, with their difficult access, their dramatic acoustic properties, their flickering firelight, and their powerful images, functioned as immersive environments designed to facilitate the transformation of consciousness and the encounter with spiritual realities that lay beyond ordinary perception. Regional variations in shamanic practice began to emerge during this period, reflecting adaptation to local environmental conditions and the development of distinct cultural traditions within the broader framework of Paleolithic spirituality. Arctic communities, facing the extreme challenges of life at the edge of the habitable world, developed techniques specifically adapted to conditions of extreme cold, limited daylight, and the unique spiritual ecology of polar regions. Temperate forest dwellers created practices suited to woodland environments, emphasizing relationships with the spirits of trees, forest animals, and the seasonal cycles of deciduous ecosystems. Steppe and grassland peoples developed shamanic traditions oriented toward the great herds of herbivores that provided their primary sustenance, creating spiritual technologies for locating, attracting, and successfully hunting these crucial prey animals. These regional adaptations would eventually give rise to the diverse shamanic traditions documented among historical peoples across Eurasia, each representing thousands of years of refinement and adaptation to specific environmental and cultural conditions. The social organization required to support shamanic practitioners reveals the high value placed on spiritual services within Upper Paleolithic communities and provides evidence that these activities were considered essential rather than peripheral to community survival. The time and resources invested in creating shamanic tools, ritual spaces, and ceremonial equipment indicate that communities were willing to divert significant labor and materials from immediate subsistence activities to support spiritual practices whose benefits were understood to be crucial for long-term prosperity. The elaborate burial treatments accorded to apparent shamanic practitioners, with their rich grave goods and careful positioning, demonstrate that these individuals occupied positions of considerable respect and influence within their societies, positions that were recognized and honored even after death through mortuary rituals that ensured their continued spiritual presence and assistance. The evidence from the Upper Paleolithic period establishes beyond reasonable doubt that shamanic practices represent one of the oldest and most fundamental forms of human spiritual expression, emerging alongside the development of modern human cognitive capabilities and persisting through all subsequent phases of human cultural evolution. The techniques developed during this period, including the use of rhythmic sound to alter consciousness, the cultivation of relationships with animal spirit helpers, the practice of soul journey to other realms of existence, and the performance of healing rituals that address both physical and spiritual causes of illness, would continue to characterize shamanic practice throughout human history, adapted to countless different cultural contexts, but maintaining their essential characteristics across tens of thousands of years of continuous development. The painted caves of Europe, the carved figurines of Siberia, and the burial sites scattered across the Paleolithic world stand as monuments to this ancient spiritual awakening, testifying to the profound human need for connection with dimensions of reality that transcend the merely physical and material. The vast expanse of Siberia, stretching from the Ural Mountains in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east, from the Arctic tundra in the north to the steppes of Mongolia in the south, served as the great crucible where shamanic practices achieved their most sophisticated, systematic, and enduring forms. Within this immense landscape of taiga forests, frozen tundra, mighty rivers, and towering mountain ranges, indigenous peoples developed spiritual technologies that would not only define classical shamanism for scholars and practitioners alike, but would also provide the very terminology through which the entire world would come to understand these ancient practices. The word shaman itself, now used globally to describe spiritual practitioners who employ techniques of ecstasy to communicate with spirit worlds, derives from the Tungusic languages of Central and Eastern Siberia, entering world vocabulary through a chain of transmission that reflects the unique historical circumstances of Russian expansion into these remote territories. The Evenki people, formerly known as the Tungus, along with related groups such as the Nanai, Ulchi, and Orochen, used the term Saman to designate their spiritual practitioners, individuals who possessed the ability to enter altered states of consciousness and travel to spirit realms where they could negotiate with supernatural beings on behalf of their communities. This term, possibly connected etymologically to the Sanskrit shramana, meaning ascetic or religious practitioner, though this connection remains debated among linguists, entered Russian vocabulary during the 16th and 17th centuries as Cossack explorers, fur traders, and Orthodox missionaries pushed eastward across Siberia in search of valuable pelts and souls to convert. These Russian observers, encountering spiritual specialists among the Evenki and other Tungusic peoples, adopted the indigenous terminology to describe practitioners whose activities seemed fundamentally different from anything in their own religious experience. The term subsequently entered German academic literature through the works of researchers studying Siberian peoples during the 18th century, and from there spread into broader European scholarly discourse, eventually becoming the standard designation for similar practitioners found not only throughout Siberia, but across the entire world. This linguistic history is significant because it establishes Siberia as the type locality for shamanic practice, the region whose traditions have most profoundly shaped scholarly and popular understanding of what shamanism is and how it operates. While shamanic practices exist on every inhabited continent and display enormous variation in their specific characteristics, the Siberian traditions remain the benchmark against which other forms are compared, and the source of the conceptual frameworks through which shamanic phenomena are analyzed and understood. The cultural significance of the shaman among Tungusic peoples extended far beyond simple religious leadership to encompass virtually every aspect of community life that required mediation between the human world and the complex spiritual ecosystem that surrounded and interpenetrated physical reality. Unlike the hereditary priesthoods that developed in agricultural civilizations, where religious authority was transmitted through family lineages and institutional structures, Siberian shamans were typically called to their vocation through direct spiritual intervention, often manifesting as a profound crisis that marked their selection by the spirit world for shamanic service. This calling, known among the Evenki as shamanic illness or shamanic madness, represented the beginning of a transformative process that would fundamentally alter the individual's relationship with both physical and spiritual reality, reshaping their consciousness, their social role, and their very identity as human beings. The onset of shamanic calling typically occurred during adolescence or early adulthood, though cases of later calling were not unknown, particularly among individuals who had resisted or been unaware of earlier spiritual summons. The prospective shaman would experience a severe illness that defied all conventional treatment, characterized by symptoms that might include prolonged fevers, seizures, periods of unconsciousness or catatonia, vivid hallucinations, and profound psychological disturbance that could manifest as depression, anxiety, or apparent madness. During these episodes, the afflicted individual would report encounters with spiritual beings who announced their selection for shamanic service, often in terms that allowed no refusal. The spirits might appear as ancestors who had themselves been shamans, as animal beings who offered themselves as helpers and guides, or as powerful deities who demanded the individual's service in exchange for the restoration of health and sanity. The Yakut people of northeastern Siberia described this process as being grasped by the shamanic calling, an image that conveys the involuntary and often overwhelming nature of the experience. The Buryat of the Lake Baikal region spoke of spirits choosing an individual, selecting them from among their community for reasons that might include hereditary predisposition, unusual circumstances of birth, physical abnormalities that marked spiritual significance, or simply the inscrutable preferences of supernatural beings. Regardless of the specific cultural framework through which the experience was interpreted, the shamanic calling was understood throughout Siberia as a genuine spiritual event, not a psychological disorder or social role that could be voluntarily assumed. Those who attempted to practice shamanism without authentic calling were believed to be ineffective at best and endangered at worst, lacking the spiritual relationships and supernatural sanction that enabled genuine shamans to perform their work safely and successfully. During the initiatory illness, candidates experienced what shamanic traditions throughout Siberia described as spiritual dismemberment and reconstruction, a visionary ordeal that transformed their very being and equipped them with the spiritual anatomy necessary for shamanic work. In their visions and dreams, prospective shamans witnessed their own bodies being taken apart by spiritual beings, their flesh stripped from their bones, their organs removed and examined, their skeletal structure disassembled and carefully inspected. The spirits performing this dismemberment, often described as ancestral shamans or powerful animal beings, would count the candidate's bones to ensure none were missing, as the possession of extra bones was considered a sign of exceptional shamanic power. They would replace the candidate's ordinary heart with a new one capable of spiritual sight and feeling, install additional organs that would enable perception of and interaction with the spirit world, and reassemble the transformed body with new capabilities that transcended ordinary human limitations. The Buryat tradition provided particularly detailed accounts of this initiatory dismemberment, describing how the spirits would boil the candidate's flesh in great cauldrons to separate it from the bones, how they would forge new organs from spiritual substances, and how they would reassemble the transformed individual with capabilities that included the ability to see spirits, to travel outside the physical body, to withstand extremes of heat and cold, and to perceive events occurring at great distances. These experiences, while terrifying and painful to undergo, were understood as absolutely necessary transformations that equipped the individual with the spiritual anatomy required for shamanic work. Without this death and rebirth at the hands of the spirits, no one could safely or effectively practice shamanism, regardless of their desire or their training in shamanic techniques. The training period that followed the initial calling and initiatory experiences could extend for many years, sometimes decades, under the guidance of experienced shamanic teachers who transmitted the vast body of knowledge and technique required for effective practice. Among the Evenki, novice shamans learned to identify and cultivate relationships with their personal helper spirits, the supernatural allies who would assist them in all their shamanic work. They mastered the techniques of soul travel, learning to project their consciousness out of their physical bodies and navigate the complex geography of the spirit world. They developed proficiency in the elaborate ritual protocols required for different types of shamanic work, memorizing the specific songs, prayers, invocations, and procedures appropriate for healing ceremonies, divination sessions, funerary rites, and the countless other occasions that required shamanic intervention. This education included extensive memorization of spiritual genealogies that traced the lineages of helper spirits and their relationships to human shamanic lineages, mythological narratives that explained the origins and nature of the cosmos and its spiritual inhabitants, and the proper procedures for conducting every type of ceremony that a shaman might be called upon to perform. Students learn to recognize the signs and symptoms of different types of spiritual affliction, to diagnose the supernatural causes of illness and misfortune, and to determine the appropriate interventions for each type of problem. They studied the characteristics of the countless spiritual beings that populated the Siberian cosmos, learning which could be safely approached, which required special precautions, which could be commanded, and which must be petitioned, and how to negotiate with each type of entity to achieve desired outcomes. The training process also included the crafting of shamanic tools and regalia, activities that themselves required spiritual guidance and the observance of specific ritual protocols. The creation of a shaman's drum, costume, and other equipment was not merely a matter of technical skill, but a spiritual undertaking that required the cooperation of supernatural beings and the proper performance of consecration rituals that imbued the finished objects with spiritual power. Novice shamans learned to select appropriate materials, to prepare them according to traditional methods, to assemble them into functional ritual equipment, and to activate their spiritual potential through ceremonies that established connections between the physical objects and the supernatural forces they were designed to channel and control. Siberian shamanic cosmology presented a universe structured around the concept of the world tree, a cosmic axis that connected the multiple levels of existence and served as the primary pathway for shamanic journeys between realms. This great tree, known by various names among different Siberian peoples, the Yakut called it Aluk Mas, the sacred tree of life, extended its roots deep into the underworld, the realm of the dead and of powerful chthonic spirits, while its branches reached into the highest heavens, the dwelling place of celestial deities and the most elevated spiritual beings. The trunk of this cosmic tree passed through the middle world, the level of ordinary physical existence where humans dwelt, providing a stable vertical axis that oriented the entire cosmos and enabled movement between its different levels. Along the length of the world tree grew various plants and nested various animals that corresponded to different spiritual powers and served as guides or obstacles for shamanic practitioners during their otherworldly travels. Birds inhabited the upper branches, serving as messengers between the heavenly realms and the middle world, and often functioning as spirit helpers for shamans engaged in celestial journeys. Serpents and other creatures associated with the earth coiled around the trunk or dwelt among the roots, guarding the passages to the underworld and requiring propitiation or negotiation before allowing shamanic travelers to pass. The imagery of the world tree appeared throughout Siberian shamanic art and ritual, depicted on drums, embroidered on costumes, carved on ritual implements, and visualized during shamanic journeys as the primary landmark and pathway of the spirit world. The three-tiered universe of Siberian shamanism divided existence into distinct but interconnected realms, each populated by specific types of spiritual beings and governed by particular laws and customs that shamanic practitioners had to understand and respect. The upper world, consisting of multiple heavenly levels, the Buryat tradition described 17 such levels, each presided over by specific Tengri or sky spirits, housed the great celestial deities who controlled cosmic phenomena such as the movements of the sun and moon, the patterns of the stars, and the fundamental forces that maintained the order of the universe. These upper realms also contained the souls of powerful shamans who had achieved elevated spiritual status after death, ancestors who continued to provide guidance and assistance to their living descendants, and various categories of benevolent spirits who could be petitioned for blessings and protection. The middle world encompassed not only the physical realm of human habitation, but also a parallel spiritual landscape that interpenetrated material reality at every point. Here dwelt the spirits of natural features, the masters of mountains, rivers, forests, and lakes, who controlled access to the resources these features provided, and who required proper recognition and propitiation from humans who wished to hunt, fish, gather, or travel within their domains. The middle world also contained the souls of living beings, both human and animal, as well as various categories of spirits that were neither fully celestial nor fully chthonic, but occupied intermediate positions in the cosmic hierarchy. Many of the helper spirits that assisted shamanic practitioners in their work inhabited this middle realm, making it the most frequently traveled and most intimately known of the three cosmic levels. The lower world, reached by descending through the roots of the world tree, or through openings in the earth, such as caves, springs, or the burrows of certain animals, contained multiple subterranean levels where dwelt the spirits of the dead, powerful chthonic deities, and beings associated with the earth's depths and the mysteries of death and regeneration. Among the Yakut, this realm was ruled by Arsan Duolai, the fearsome lord of the underworld, who governed the souls of the deceased and controlled access to the deepest shamanic mysteries. The lower world was not conceived primarily as a place of punishment or evil, as in many Western religious traditions, but rather as a necessary component of the cosmic order, a realm where certain types of spiritual work could only be accomplished and where specific categories of knowledge and power could be obtained. Shamanic journeys to the lower world were considered particularly dangerous and were typically undertaken only by experienced practitioners for specific purposes such as retrieving lost souls, obtaining information from the dead, or negotiating with shamanic powers. The shamanic drum occupied a position of central importance in Siberian shamanic practice, serving simultaneously as a vehicle for spiritual travel, a map of the cosmic realms, a repository of shamanic power, and a tool for inducing the altered states of consciousness necessary for shamanic work. These instruments, typically constructed from the wood of spiritually significant trees and covered with the hide of ritually hunted or sacrificed animals, bore painted or carved symbols that depicted the shamanic cosmos and provided navigational aids for otherworldly journeys. The Sami drums of northern Scandinavia, closely related to Siberian traditions, featured intricate symbolic systems that mapped the relationships between different spiritual realms, the locations of important supernatural beings, and the pathways that shamanic travelers could follow during their journeys. Mongolian and Buryat shamanic drums often displayed representations of the world tree, complete with the various beings that inhabited its different levels, creating portable cosmological maps that oriented the shaman's consciousness during ritual performances. The construction of a shamanic drum required careful attention to spiritual as well as technical considerations, transforming what might appear to be a simple musical instrument into a powerful spiritual tool imbued with supernatural potency. The wood for the frame was typically obtained from trees that had been marked by spiritual significance, struck by lightning, growing in unusual locations, or identified through dreams or divination as appropriate for drum making. The hide came from animals that had been ritually hunted or sacrificed specifically for this purpose, with the hunting or sacrifice conducted according to protocols that honored the animal's spirit and secured its cooperation in the drum's spiritual functions. The process of assembling these components involved elaborate ceremonies during which the drum was consecrated and imbued with spiritual power, often including the invocation of the spirits who would inhabit the instrument and assist the shaman in their work. Among the Caucasus people of southern Siberia, drum making required a series of rituals extending over several months, during which the instrument gradually acquired its spiritual potency and developed its capacity to serve as a vehicle for shamanic travel. The drum was understood not as an inanimate object, but as a living being, often conceived as a horse or reindeer that would carry the shaman on their journeys through the spirit world. This conception was reflected in the terminology used to describe the drum and its parts. The drumstick was often called a whip, the drum's surface was its back, and the metal or wooden crosspiece inside the drum was its backbone or spine. The relationship between shaman and drum was intimate and personal, with each drum being uniquely suited to its owner and potentially dangerous if used by unauthorized individuals. Shamanic costumes represented another crucial category of ritual equipment, serving as both protective armor for spiritual combat and symbolic representations of the shaman's transformed spiritual anatomy. These elaborate garments, constructed from leather, fur, and fabric, were adorned with hundreds of metal ornaments that served specific spiritual functions far beyond mere decoration. Iron pendants shaped like animals, tools, weapons, and human figures represented the shaman's helper spirits and sources of power, each ornament corresponding to a specific supernatural ally whose assistance could be invoked during ritual performances. Chains and bells attached to the costume created distinctive sounds during shamanic ceremonies that were believed to attract beneficial spirits while repelling harmful entities, and the rhythmic jingling of these metal attachments contributed to the auditory environment that facilitated altered states of consciousness. The Yakut shamanic costume included a leather coat decorated with iron representations of the shaman's spiritual helpers, including miniature figures of animals, birds, fish, and anthropomorphic beings, whose assistance the shaman could call upon during different types of work. The back of the coat often featured a large iron representation of the world tree, establishing the shaman's connection to the cosmic axis and their ability to travel along its length to different levels of existence. The front of the costume displayed symbols associated with the shaman's personal spiritual lineage, including representations of ancestral shamans whose power continued to flow through their living descendant. A distinctive iron crown or headpiece completed the ensemble, often incorporating representations of antlers, bird feathers, or other animal attributes that symbolized the shaman's ability to assume animal forms and perspectives during spiritual journeys. The metal ornaments on shamanic costumes served purposes that extended far beyond symbolic representation to include practical spiritual functions that enhanced the shaman's effectiveness and safety during ritual work. Iron representations of snakes provided protection against malevolent spirits, as serpents were believed to possess the ability to detect and neutralize supernatural threats. Bird figures, particularly those representing eagles, hawks, and other raptors, enabled the shaman to fly during otherworldly travels and provided the keen spiritual vision necessary for perceiving distant events and hidden realities. Human figures depicted the shaman's spiritual assistants, each with specialized functions in different types of shamanic work. Some were skilled at healing, others at divination, others at combat with hostile spirits, and still others at guiding souls through the realms of the dead. The total weight of these metal ornaments could exceed 30 pounds or more, requiring considerable physical strength and endurance to wear during lengthy ritual performances that might continue for hours or even days. This physical demand was itself understood as spiritually significant, as the ability to bear the weight of the costume while performing the vigorous movements of shamanic ritual demonstrated the practitioner's spiritual power and their capacity to channel supernatural forces. The sound produced by the movement of these metal ornaments created a distinctive auditory signature for each shaman, a personal sonic identity that announced their presence to both human and spiritual audiences, and that could be recognized even when the shaman themselves was not visible. The crafting of shamanic regalia involved collaboration between the shaman and skilled metalworkers who possessed specialized knowledge of spiritual symbolism and ritual requirements. Among the Bariat, blacksmiths who created shamanic ornaments were themselves considered to possess spiritual powers, as their ability to transform raw metal into sacred objects required supernatural assistance and placed them in contact with powerful spiritual forces associated with fire, transformation, and creation. The forging process included specific rituals and observances designed to ensure that the finished products would function effectively as spiritual tools rather than mere decorative items. The smith might fast before beginning work, offer prayers and sacrifices to the spirits of fire and metal, and observe various taboos during the forging process to maintain the spiritual purity necessary for creating objects of sacred power. The frozen expanse of the Arctic Circle, where winter darkness stretches for months without relief, and summer brings only brief respite from the eternal cold, fostered shamanic traditions that developed unique characteristics in response to the extreme environmental challenges of polar existence. Among the Inuit peoples scattered across the vast territories of Alaska, northern Canada, and Greenland, the Angakuk emerged as essential spiritual practitioners whose abilities could mean the difference between community survival and catastrophic failure in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. These Arctic shamans operated within a cosmological framework that recognized the polar landscape as densely populated with spiritual beings whose cooperation was absolutely essential for human survival. Beings whose moods and preferences could shift as unpredictably as the Arctic weather itself. Unlike the more hierarchical spirit worlds described in some temperate and tropical shamanic traditions, Arctic shamanism dealt with a complex, fluid network of spirits that inhabited every element of the polar environment, and that required constant attention and negotiation to maintain favorable relationships. Sela, the great spirit of weather and atmosphere, controlled the fierce storms that could trap hunters on the ice for days or weeks, the winds that determined whether travel was possible, and the temperature fluctuations that could transform safe ice into deadly thin sheets without warning. Sedna, the powerful sea goddess dwelling in her house beneath the ocean floor, governed the availability of seals, walruses, whales, and other marine mammals that provided the primary sustenance for most Arctic communities. The spirits of individual animals possessed their own agency and could choose whether to offer themselves to hunters or withdraw entirely if proper spiritual protocols were not observed. The training of Angakuit began with the recognition of individuals who demonstrated unusual sensitivity to spiritual phenomena, a sensitivity that might manifest in various ways depending on the specific cultural context and the individual's particular gifts. Some prospective shamans displayed the ability to predict weather changes with uncanny accuracy, perceiving shifts in atmospheric conditions before any physical signs were apparent. Others could locate game animals when conventional tracking methods failed, sensing the presence of seals beneath the ice or caribou beyond the horizon through means that defied ordinary explanation. Still others perceived the spiritual causes of illness and misfortune, identifying the specific violations of taboo or failures of proper observance that had brought supernatural displeasure upon individuals or communities. Prospective Angakuit underwent rigorous initiation processes that tested their capacity to survive extreme conditions while maintaining the spiritual awareness necessary for shamanic work. These initiations often required candidates to spend extended periods alone on the ice, fasting until they achieved the visions that would reveal their spirit helpers and teach them the techniques necessary for shamanic practice. The physical ordeal of surviving alone in temperatures that could reach 60 degrees below zero, without food and often without adequate shelter, created conditions of extreme physiological stress that facilitated the breakthrough into altered states of consciousness. The isolation removed all social support and distraction, forcing the candidate to confront the spirits directly and to develop the personal relationships with supernatural beings that would sustain their shamanic practice throughout their lives. The most crucial function of Inuit Angakuit involved weather working, the ability to influence atmospheric conditions through spiritual intervention in an environment where weather could transform from calm to life-threatening within minutes. Arctic weather systems possessed a volatility that made accurate prediction and potential influence over meteorological phenomena essential for community survival. A hunting party caught on the sea ice by an unexpected storm could perish within hours if they could not find shelter or if the ice beneath them broke up in the violent conditions. A community dependent on the spring seal hunt could face starvation if storms prevented hunters from reaching the breathing holes where seals could be taken. The ability to predict and potentially to influence these critical weather patterns made weather-working Angakuit among the most valued and respected members of their communities. Angakuit developed sophisticated techniques for reading atmospheric signs that combined careful empirical observation with spiritual insight into the hidden forces that drove weather patterns. They monitored cloud formations, noting the specific shapes and movements that presage different types of weather. They observed wind patterns, tracking shifts in direction and intensity that indicated approaching changes. They watched animal behavior, recognizing that seals, birds, and other creatures often responded to atmospheric changes before humans could detect them. They noted subtle variations in ice conditions, the sounds the ice made, the way snow behaved, and countless other environmental indicators that provided information about current and future weather. But beyond this empirical knowledge, they also maintained ongoing relationships with Sila and other atmospheric spirits that enabled them to perceive weather patterns through spiritual means and, in some cases, to negotiate for favorable conditions. The practice of weatherworking required Angakuit to enter deep trance states during which their souls traveled to the realm of atmospheric spirits to conduct negotiations for specific weather conditions. These journeys involved complex diplomatic protocols, as weather spirits possessed their own agendas and preferences, and could not simply be commanded to produce desired conditions. Successful weatherworking required the Angakuk to offer appropriate compensation, which might include spiritual energy, promises of future offerings, agreements to perform specific ritual obligations, or other forms of exchange that satisfied the spirit's requirements. The most skilled weatherworkers could allegedly calm dangerous storms, create favorable winds for kayak travel, bring clear skies for crucial hunting activities, or delay the onset of winter conditions that would end the hunting season. However, such interventions came at considerable personal cost and could not be performed frequently without depleting the shaman's spiritual resources or straining relationships with the spirits whose cooperation was required. Soul retrieval represented another critical function of Arctic shamanism, addressing a common spiritual diagnosis for various forms of illness, psychological disturbance, and persistent misfortune. Inuit spiritual understanding recognized that human beings possessed multiple soul components that could become separated from the physical body under certain circumstances, resulting in conditions that ranged from mild malaise to life-threatening illness. Severe trauma, whether physical or emotional, could cause soul loss, as could prolonged illness, encounters with malevolent spirits, violations of important taboos, or the magical attacks of hostile shamans. The symptoms of soul loss included lethargy, depression, inability to concentrate, loss of appetite, progressive physical weakening, and a general sense of disconnection from life that could ultimately prove fatal if not addressed through shamanic intervention. The process of soul retrieval required the Angakuk to track the missing soul component through the spirit world, navigating the complex geography of Arctic cosmology to locate where the soul had become trapped, hidden, or held captive. These retrieval operations involved considerable risk, as the shaman's own soul had to travel through potentially dangerous spiritual territories while maintaining sufficient connection to their physical body to ensure safe return. The journey might lead into the underwater realm of Sedna, where souls could become entangled in the sea goddess's hair and require delicate negotiation to free. It might venture into the aurora borealis, where souls could become lost among the dancing lights that represented the spirits of the dead playing ball with a walrus skull. It might descend into the earth, where souls might be held by spirits of the land, or ascend into the sky, where they might have been taken by celestial beings. Upon locating the missing soul, the Angakuk had to negotiate or fight for its return, depending on the circumstances of its loss and the nature of the beings holding it. Souls lost through trauma might simply need to be found and gently guided back to their owners. Souls taken by spirits as punishment for taboo violations might require the shaman to negotiate terms for their release, often involving promises of changed behavior or compensatory offerings from the patient. Souls captured by hostile shamans or malevolent spirits might need to be rescued through spiritual combat, with the Angakuk using their helper spirits and personal power to overcome the entities holding the soul captive. The successful return of a lost soul often produced dramatic improvements in the patient's condition, as the restored spiritual component brought back vitality, clarity, and connection to life that had been missing during the period of soul loss. The technique of soul flight enabled Angakukit to project their consciousness across vast distances, gathering information, communicating with distant communities, or locating missing persons in an environment where small groups could easily become separated and lost in the featureless white expanse of the Arctic landscape. This ability proved particularly valuable during the long winter darkness, when travel was dangerous and communities might be isolated for months at a time. An Angakuk could send their soul to observe conditions in distant areas, to check on the welfare of relatives in other camps, to locate hunters who had failed to return, or to scout for game animals whose locations could then be communicated to hunting parties. The most accomplished practitioners could allegedly project their consciousness hundreds of miles across the ice, maintaining awareness of events in multiple locations simultaneously, while their physical body remained in trance in their home community. Soul flight required extensive training to master safely, as the consciousness traveling outside the physical body remained vulnerable to various spiritual hazards that could prevent its return or cause damage during the journey. Malevolent spirits might attempt to capture or destroy the traveling soul, while hostile shamans might attack it if they detected its presence in their territory. The physical body left behind during soul flight required protection from spiritual intrusion, as entities might attempt to possess the temporarily vacant form while its owner's consciousness was elsewhere. Angakui developed elaborate techniques for securing their bodies during soul travel, including the use of protective songs and amulets, the assistance of helper spirits who guarded the body, and specific body positions that maintained the connection between consciousness and physical form, even during extended journeys. Communication with animal spirits formed the foundation of Arctic shamanic practice, as successful hunting required ongoing negotiation with the spiritual essence of prey animals, whose cooperation was essential for human survival. Inuit cosmology recognized that animals possessed souls that chose whether to make themselves available to hunters, based on the spiritual condition of both individual hunters and their communities as a whole. Violations of hunting taboos, failure to properly honor killed animals through appropriate butchering practices and disposal of remains, or other spiritual transgressions could result in animals withdrawing their cooperation, leading to famine conditions that threatened the survival of entire communities. The relationship between humans and animals was understood as reciprocal. Animals gave their bodies to feed humans, but in return, humans owed animals proper treatment, respect, and the observance of protocols that ensured the animals' souls could be reborn to provide future sustenance. Angakwit served as the primary intermediaries in these crucial relationships, conducting rituals that honored animal spirits and addressed any spiritual obstacles that might be preventing successful hunting. Before major hunting expeditions, they performed ceremonies to secure the cooperation of target species, invoking the spirits of seals, walruses, caribou, or whales, and petitioning them to make themselves available to hunters who would treat them with proper respect. When hunting proved unsuccessful despite favorable physical conditions, Angakwit conducted divination to determine the spiritual causes of the failure. Perhaps a hunter had violated a taboo, perhaps the community had failed to properly honor animals taken in previous hunts, perhaps a hostile shaman was interfering with the hunt, or perhaps the animal spirits simply required additional offerings or observances before they would cooperate. The relationship between Angakwit and Sedna, the sea goddess who controlled access to marine mammals, was particularly crucial for coastal Inuit communities whose survival depended on successful sea hunting. Sedna, according to widespread Inuit mythology, was a young woman who had been thrown from her father's boat during a storm, and whose fingers, cut off as she clung to the gunwale, had transformed into the seals, walruses, and whales that populated Arctic waters. She now dwelt in a house at the bottom of the sea, and when humans violated taboos or failed to show proper respect, the spiritual pollution resulting from these transgressions would drift down to her dwelling and become entangled in her hair, which she could not comb because she had no fingers. In her discomfort and anger, she would withhold the sea mammals, causing them to avoid hunters and bringing famine to human communities. When hunting failures indicated Sedna's displeasure, Angakuit would undertake dangerous journeys to her underwater dwelling to comb her hair, removing the tangles of spiritual pollution and soothing her anger so that she would release the animals. These journeys required the shaman to pass through numerous obstacles and dangers, guardians that blocked the path, treacherous passages that could trap the unwary, and Sedna's own fierce dog that protected her dwelling. Upon reaching Sedna, the Angakuk would gently comb her hair while speaking soothingly to her, confessing the community's transgressions and promising improved behavior. If successful, the shaman would return with Sedna's forgiveness and the promise that animals would once again make themselves available to hunters. The community would then undertake whatever purification rituals or behavioral changes were necessary to maintain Sedna's goodwill and ensure continued access to the marine resources upon which their survival depended. The Sami people of northern Scandinavia, though geographically distant from the Inuit, developed shamanic traditions that shared certain fundamental characteristics while displaying distinctive features adapted to their subarctic environment and their semi-nomadic lifestyle centered around reindeer herding. Sami shamanism, practiced by specialists known as Noaidi, incorporated the use of distinctive oval drums decorated with intricate symbolic systems that mapped the spiritual landscape of the northern Scandinavian region and provided tools for divination and spiritual navigation. These drums, constructed from birch or pine wood with reindeer hide drumheads, featured painted symbols arranged in complex patterns that encoded sophisticated cosmological information and served as both maps and instruments for shamanic practice. The symbolic systems painted on Sami drums represented sophisticated cosmological maps that encoded complex information about spiritual geography, seasonal cycles, the locations of various spiritual beings, and the relationships between different categories of supernatural entities. The central area of the drum typically depicted the world axis or cosmic pillar, often represented as a sun symbol or a stylized tree, surrounded by representations of the sun, moon, and major constellations that served as reference points for shamanic navigation and for timing important activities according to celestial cycles. The upper portion of the drum showed the realm of sky spirits and celestial deities, including representations of the sun god, the thunder god, and other powerful beings who controlled weather, fertility, and cosmic order. The lower section depicted the underworld and its inhabitants, including the goddess of death and the spirits of deceased ancestors who continued to influence the lives of their living descendants. Human and animal figures scattered across the drum's surface represented different types of spiritual beings, including helper spirits who assisted the Noaidi in their work, dangerous entities who posed threats to travelers in the spirit world, and the shamanic practitioner themselves, shown in various activities such as drumming, traveling, or communicating with spirits. The specific arrangement and selection of symbols varied between drums, reflecting the personal spiritual relationships and specialized knowledge of individual practitioners, but the overall structure remained consistent enough that drums from different regions and time periods can be recognized as belonging to a shared tradition with common cosmological foundations. Drum divination among the Sami involved the use of a brass ring or piece of reindeer antler, called a vorbi, that was placed on the drum head and allowed to move across the painted symbols as the drum was beaten with a T-shaped hammer. The path taken by this indicator object as it bounced and slid across the vibrating drumhead was interpreted according to complex systems of meaning that related the symbols it touched to specific questions or concerns. The Noaidi would formulate a question, begin drumming while focusing their intention on the matter at hand, and observe which symbols the vorbi contacted during its movement. Skilled practitioners could allegedly determine the location of lost reindeer, predict weather conditions, diagnose the spiritual causes of illness, identify thieves, locate suitable marriage partners, and provide guidance for virtually any important decision through careful interpretation of the indicator's movement patterns. The practice of joik, traditional Sami songs that combine distinctive vocal techniques with spiritual invocation, formed an integral component of shamanic practice throughout northern Scandinavia. Unlike conventional songs with fixed lyrics and melodies, joiks represented personalized vocal expressions that captured the spiritual essence of specific individuals, animals, places, or phenomena. Each joik was understood to contain the spiritual power of its subject, making the practice of joiking a form of shamanic technique that could invoke the presence of spiritual beings, honor important relationships, or channel supernatural power for specific purposes. A joik for a particular reindeer would capture that animal's essential nature and could be used to call it, to honor it, or to maintain spiritual connection with it. A joik for a deceased relative would invoke their presence and maintain the bond between living and dead. A joik for a sacred mountain would honor the spirits dwelling there and could facilitate communication with those powerful beings. The vocal techniques involved in joiking included distinctive throat singing methods, rhythmic breathing patterns, and tonal variations that were believed to resonate with specific spiritual frequencies and to produce effects in the spirit world as well as the physical world. Master Noedi possessed extensive repertoires of joiks that enabled them to work with a wide range of spiritual allies and to address various types of shamanic tasks. The transmission of joiks, from teacher to student or from parent to child, represented an important form of spiritual inheritance, as the joiks carried not merely musical information, but actual spiritual power and relationship that could be passed to new practitioners. The suppression of joiking by Christian missionaries, who recognized its shamanic significance and sought to eliminate it along with other traditional practices, represented one of the most damaging aspects of the assault on Sami spiritual traditions. The vast grasslands and towering mountain ranges of Central Asia provided the geographical foundation for some of the most sophisticated and enduring shamanic traditions in human history, traditions that would prove remarkably resilient in the face of successive waves of religious conversion, political transformation, and cultural change. Across the steppes that stretch from the Caspian Sea to the borders of China, nomadic peoples developed spiritual practices that were intimately connected to their mobile lifestyle, their seasonal migrations following the grass that fed their herds, and the complex relationships between human communities and the natural world that sustained them. These traditions would adapt to the rise and fall of great empires, survive the spread of Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity, and persist into the modern era as living spiritual systems that continue to serve their communities. Mongolian shamanism emerged from this steppe environment as perhaps the most complex and systematically developed form of nomadic spiritual practice, perfectly adapted to the pastoral nomadic lifestyle that had characterized Mongolian peoples for millennia. Unlike sedentary agricultural societies that developed fixed religious centers, permanent temples, and hereditary priesthoods tied to specific locations, Mongolian shamanism was inherently portable, carried in the minds and ritual equipment of specialized practitioners who traveled with their communities across the vast seasonal migration routes that defined nomadic existence. The entire spiritual technology of Mongolian shamanism, its cosmology, its rituals, its tools, and its practitioners, was designed for mobility, capable of being packed onto horses or camels and transported across hundreds of miles as communities followed their herds to new pastures. The Mongolian cosmological system recognized the eternal blue sky, Tengri, as the supreme spiritual force governing all existence. an overarching divine presence that encompassed and transcended all other spiritual beings. This sky deity was not conceived as a distant, abstract divinity removed from earthly concerns, but as an active presence that directly influenced human affairs through weather patterns, seasonal changes, and the success or failure of human endeavors. The relationship between humans and Tengri was mediated through proper behavior, appropriate rituals, and the maintenance of cosmic harmony that ensured the sky god's continued benevolence. Beneath Tengri's overarching authority, the Mongolian spiritual universe was populated by countless spirits associated with specific geographical features, natural phenomena, and ancestral lineages, creating a complex spiritual ecosystem that required constant attention and skilled navigation. Mountains, rivers, lakes, springs, and even individual trees and rocks possessed their own spiritual guardians, beings known as Gazrian Ized, or Masters of the Land, who controlled access to the resources these features provided, and who required proper recognition and propitiation from humans who wished to use their domains. These spirits were not abstract concepts, but vivid personalities with specific characteristics, preferences, and histories that shamanic practitioners had to know and respect. The spirit of a particular mountain might be benevolent toward those who approached with proper offerings, but hostile toward those who showed disrespect. The spirit of a river might grant safe crossing to those who performed appropriate rituals, but cause drowning for those who neglected these observances. The intricate knowledge of these countless spiritual beings and their requirements formed a crucial component of shamanic training and practice. Mongolian shamans, known as Bu, male, or Yudgen, female, served as the primary intermediaries between their communities and this complex spiritual ecosystem, possessing the knowledge and abilities necessary to communicate with spirits, diagnose spiritual problems, and conduct the rituals that maintained proper relationships between humans and the supernatural world. These practitioners underwent rigorous training that began with recognition of their calling through spiritual signs or hereditary transmission of shamanic abilities. The calling might manifest through dreams in which spirits announced their selection of the individual, through illness that could only be cured by accepting the shamanic vocation, through unusual circumstances of birth that marked spiritual significance, or through the inheritance of shamanic abilities from deceased relatives, whose spirits continued to work through their living descendants. The training process involved extensive memorization of genealogical traditions that traced both human and spiritual lineages, mythological narratives that explained the origins and nature of the cosmos, and the ritual procedures necessary for conducting the various ceremonies that marked important transitions in nomadic life. Novice shamans learned to identify and cultivate relationships with their personal helper spirits, supernatural allies who would assist them throughout their careers. They mastered the techniques of spiritual travel, learning to project their consciousness into the spirit world and navigate its complex geography. They developed proficiency in the songs, prayers, and invocations appropriate for different types of shamanic work, memorizing vast repertoires of ritual language that had been transmitted across generations of practitioners. The integration of shamanic practice with nomadic lifestyle created unique characteristics that distinguished Mongolian shamanism from the traditions of sedentary peoples. Shamanic ceremonies were designed to be conducted in the portable felt tents called gur, or yurt in Russian terminology, that served as the primary dwellings of nomadic families. The circular structure of the gyr, with its central hearth and smoke hole opening to the sky, provided a natural cosmological template that oriented ritual activity according to the same spatial principles that governed the universe itself. The door of the gyr faced south, toward the sun's path across the sky, The northern area, opposite the door, was the place of honor, where sacred objects were kept and important guests were seated. The eastern side was associated with male activities and the western with female, creating a gendered spatial organization that was reflected in the positioning of participants during shamanic ceremonies. Ritual equipment was crafted to be lightweight and durable, capable of withstanding the constant movement and harsh environmental conditions of nomadic life. Shamanic drums were constructed with frames that could be disassembled for transport and reassembled at new campsites. Costumes were designed to be packed efficiently while protecting the delicate metal ornaments that adorned them. Sacred objects were stored in specially made containers that cushioned them against the jolting of travel, while keeping them accessible for ritual use. The timing of major ceremonies was coordinated with seasonal migrations, ensuring that important spiritual observances coincided with the practical requirements of pastoral nomadism, rather than conflicting with the essential activities of herding and moving. Livestock protection represented one of the most crucial functions of Mongolian shamanic practice, as the survival of nomadic communities depended entirely on the health and productivity of their herds. Shamans conducted elaborate rituals designed to protect horses, cattle, sheep, goats, and camels from disease, predation, and spiritual harm that might reduce their numbers or productivity. These ceremonies involved the creation and placement of protective amulets on individual animals, or at the entrances to corrals and pastures, the performance of purification rituals that cleansed herds of spiritual contamination, and the invocation of guardian spirits who would watch over grazing animals during their movements across the steppe. The most skilled shamans allegedly possessed the ability to locate lost animals through spiritual divination, to heal sick livestock through supernatural intervention, and to influence the behavior of wolves and other predators that threatened domesticated herds. The relationship between Mongolian shamans and their horses created particularly intimate spiritual bonds that reflected the central importance of these animals in nomadic culture. Horses served not only as transportation and military assets, but also as spiritual allies whose cooperation was essential for successful shamanic practice. The drum used by Mongolian shamans was often conceived as a spiritual horse that carried the practitioner on journeys through the spirit world, and the drumstick was called a whip, used to urge this supernatural mount to greater speed. Shamanic practitioners developed ongoing relationships with the spirits of their horses, conducting regular rituals that honored these animals and ensured their continued loyalty and effectiveness. The most powerful shamans were said to possess supernatural horses, invisible spirit steeds that could travel between worlds and carry their riders on journeys that transcended the limitations of physical space and time. Seasonal migration ceremonies marked the major transitions in the nomadic calendar and required extensive shamanic participation to ensure successful completion of these critical movements. Before beginning spring migrations to summer pastures, shamans conducted divination rituals that determined the optimal routes, timing, and spiritual preparations necessary for safe travel. These ceremonies involved consultation with the spirits of geographical features along the migration routes, propitiation of weather deities to ensure favorable conditions, and the performance of protective rituals that shielded the community from spiritual hazards during the vulnerable period of movement. The selection of campsites required shamanic approval to ensure that temporary settlements were established in locations possessing favorable spiritual characteristics and avoiding areas inhabited by malevolent entities or marked by spiritual pollution from past events. The autumn return to winter quarters involved equally elaborate spiritual preparations as communities prepared for the harsh months of cold and reduced mobility that characterize steppe winters. Shamans conducted ceremonies that stockpiled spiritual protection for the winter period, established relationships with the guardian spirits of winter campsites, and performed divination to predict weather conditions and potential challenges during the coming cold season. These rituals often involved the sacrifice of animals whose meat would sustain the community during winter, while their spirits provided ongoing protection and guidance during the period of seasonal confinement. The transition between seasons was understood as a spiritually dangerous time when the boundaries between worlds became more permeable, and when both beneficial and harmful spiritual influences were more likely to affect human communities. The Tibetan Plateau, with its extreme altitude, harsh climate, and dramatic mountain landscapes, fostered the development of Bon traditions that represented one of the most sophisticated pre-Buddhist shamanic systems in Central Asia. The Bon religion, which dominated Tibetan spiritual life before the introduction of Buddhism in the 7th century CE, incorporated shamanic elements that had been refined over centuries of development in the unique environment of the high Himalayas. Bon practitioners, known as Bonpo, maintained traditions that combined classical shamanic techniques with elaborate philosophical and ritual systems that rivaled the complexity of any organized religion, creating a spiritual technology that addressed every aspect of human existence, from birth to death and beyond. Bon cosmology presented a universe structured around the concept of the cosmic mountain, a sacred peak that served as the axis connecting different levels of existence and providing the foundation for all spiritual activity. This mountain, identified with Mount Kailash in western Tibet, was understood to be the dwelling place of supreme Bon deities and the source of spiritual power that flowed throughout the Tibetan landscape. The cosmic mountain was surrounded by 4 great rivers that flowed in the cardinal directions, creating a mandala-like pattern that served as a template for understanding the spiritual geography of the Tibetan plateau and for orienting ritual activity according to cosmological principles. The imagery of the cosmic mountain appeared throughout Bon art and ritual, depicted in paintings, sculptures, and architectural arrangements that replicated the sacred geography on various scales. The integration of shamanic elements within Bon tradition created a sophisticated system of spiritual practice that incorporated techniques for soul travel, communication with spiritual beings, divination, healing, and the manipulation of natural forces through ritual intervention. Bonpo practitioners maintain the classical shamanic emphasis on direct spiritual experience while developing elaborate theoretical frameworks that explain the mechanics of spiritual phenomena and provided systematic approaches to advanced practice. This combination of experiential shamanism with philosophical sophistication created a unique tradition that would profoundly influence subsequent developments in Tibetan Buddhism, while maintaining its distinct identity and practices. Bon ritual practices included the use of elaborate ceremonies designed to propitiate the numerous deities and spirits that populated the Tibetan spiritual landscape. These rituals often involved the construction of temporary sacred spaces using colored sands, ritual objects, and symbolic representations that created microcosmic replicas of the cosmic order. The performance of these ceremonies required extensive training and the proper procedures for invoking different categories of spiritual beings, and the specific offerings and protocols appropriate for each type of entity. The complexity of Bon ritual rivaled that of the most elaborate religious traditions anywhere in the world, with major ceremonies extending over days or weeks and requiring the participation of multiple specialists with different areas of expertise. The mountainous terrain and vast river systems of East Asia witnessed a gradual transformation of shamanic practices as they encountered the emerging philosophical systems and organized religions that would reshape the spiritual landscape of this region over thousands of years. In China, Korea, and Japan, ancient shamanic traditions did not simply disappear with the rise of Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and other institutional belief systems. Instead, these primal spiritual technologies adapted, evolved, and found new expressions within the complex religious environments of East Asian civilizations, creating syncretic systems that preserved essential shamanic elements while incorporating new philosophical frameworks and ritual forms. The Wu tradition of ancient China represents one of the earliest documented forms of shamanic practice in East Asia, with evidence dating back to the Shang dynasty of the 2nd millennium BCE. Oracle bone inscriptions from this period describe Wu practitioners as intermediaries between the human world and the realm of ancestral spirits, individuals capable of inducing rain, healing illness, communicating with deceased rulers, and performing various other functions that required access to supernatural powers. These early Chinese shamans operated within a cosmological framework that recognized the existence of multiple spiritual realms connected by pathways that skilled practitioners could traverse, a framework that shared fundamental characteristics with shamanic traditions found throughout Northern Asia, while adapting to the specific cultural and political conditions of early Chinese civilization. Wu shamanism developed sophisticated techniques for spirit mediumship that allowed practitioners to serve as vessels for various categories of spiritual beings, providing a means for supernatural entities to communicate directly with human participants during ritual ceremonies. Unlike the soul journey methods preferred by many Northern Asian shamans, who projected their consciousness out of their bodies to travel to spirit realms, Wu practitioners specialized in inviting spirits to possess their bodies, temporarily vacating their own consciousness to allow spiritual entities to speak and act through their physical forms. This possession-based approach reflected the sedentary nature of Chinese civilization, where shamanic work was typically conducted in fixed locations such as temples, shrines, or specially prepared ritual spaces rather than during migrations across vast landscapes. The Wu would enter trance states through various techniques including drumming, dancing, the consumption of alcoholic beverages, and the inhalation of aromatic substances, allowing their ordinary consciousness to withdraw, while spiritual entities took control of their physical forms. The possessed Wu could then deliver messages from the spirits, provide guidance on important matters, diagnose the causes of illness or misfortune, and perform healing interventions that channeled supernatural power through the medium's body. The dramatic nature of these possession episodes, with their altered voices, unusual movements, and apparent access to knowledge beyond normal human capacity, provided compelling evidence of genuine spiritual contact that reinforced belief in the efficacy of shamanic practice. The diagnostic and healing practices of Wu shamans incorporated early forms of what would later develop into traditional Chinese medicine, combining empirical knowledge of the body and its ailments with spiritual understanding of the supernatural causes of disease. Wu practitioners understood illness as potentially resulting from multiple causes, including spiritual imbalances, ancestral displeasure, demonic intrusion, violation of taboos, or the magical attacks of hostile practitioners. Their diagnostic methods combined careful observation of physical symptoms with spiritual techniques for perceiving the supernatural dimensions of illness, enabling them to identify both the immediate physical manifestations of disease and the underlying spiritual factors that had created conditions conducive to illness. The therapeutic methods employed by Wu shamans included herbal remedies gathered according to specific ritual protocols that ensured the plants retained their full medicinal and spiritual potency. They conducted exorcism ceremonies to remove malevolent spiritual influences that had invaded patients' bodies, using combinations of ritual actions, spoken formulas, and physical interventions to drive out the offending entities. They performed soul-calling rituals to retrieve spiritual components that had become separated from patients' bodies, traveling to spirit realms to locate and return these essential elements of the person's being. These healing methods combined empirical knowledge of medicinal plants with sophisticated understanding of the spiritual factors that influenced human health, creating comprehensive therapeutic approaches that addressed both physical and supernatural causes of illness. The integration of Wu shamanism with ancestor worship created distinctive characteristics that differentiated Chinese shamanic practice from traditions found in other regions. Chinese Wu served as specialized intermediaries who could facilitate communication between living family members and their deceased relatives, ensuring that proper respect was maintained for ancestral spirits and that guidance from the spirit world remained available to subsequent generations. This function proved particularly important in Chinese society, where family lineage and ancestral authority played central roles in social organization, political legitimacy, and individual identity. The ability to communicate with ancestors, to learn their wishes, to receive their blessings, and to address their concerns was essential for maintaining the proper order of family and society. Wu practitioners developed elaborate ritual protocols for conducting ancestral communication ceremonies that reflected the hierarchical nature of Chinese social structure. Different categories of ancestors required specific approaches based on their status during life, the length of time since their death, their position within family genealogies, and their relationship to the living individuals seeking communication. Imperial ancestors demanded the most elaborate ceremonial attention, involving complex offerings, formal protocols, and the participation of high-ranking Wu practitioners who possessed the spiritual authority to approach such elevated beings. Common family ancestors received simpler, but still carefully structured ritual recognition that maintained ongoing relationships between the living and the dead, while observing proper distinctions of rank and relationship. The transformation of Wu shamanism during the Zhou dynasty reflected broader changes occurring in Chinese civilization as political centralization, philosophical development, and social stratification created new frameworks for understanding spiritual phenomena. Zhou rulers appropriated shamanic techniques for state purposes, employing Wu practitioners to conduct weather magic that supported agricultural production, to perform divination that guided military and political decisions, and to maintain the spiritual relationships that legitimized royal authority. This institutionalization of shamanic practice within state structures began a process of transformation that would continue throughout Chinese history, as shamanic elements were incorporated into emerging philosophical and religious systems, while independent shamanic practice was increasingly marginalized or suppressed. The influence of Wu shamanism on early Taoist development represents one of the most significant examples of shamanic adaptation within an organized philosophical tradition. Taoist practitioners adopted shamanic techniques for achieving altered states of consciousness, communicating with spiritual beings, and manipulating natural forces through ritual intervention. Incorporating these methods within the philosophical framework of Taoist cosmology, the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, or effortless action, incorporated shamanic understanding of working in harmony with natural and spiritual forces, rather than attempting to dominate them through purely human effort. Taoist meditation practices included techniques derived from shamanic soul journey methods, adapted for use within systematic approaches to spiritual cultivation that aimed at immortality and union with the Tao. The development of Taoist internal alchemy drew heavily upon shamanic techniques of breath control and visualization. transforming ecstatic flight into a systematic practice of spiritual cultivation. The Taoist immortals, ascending to heaven on clouds or riding dragons through celestial realms, preserve the essential imagery of shamanic journeying within a new philosophical framework. Korean shamanism, known as Musok or Mugyo, represents one of the most vibrant and continuously practiced shamanic traditions in East Asia. The Korean Mudong, predominantly female shamans, serve as intermediaries between the human world and a complex pantheon of spirits that includes ancestors, nature deities, and historical figures who died unjustly. The Gut, the elaborate ritual ceremony performed by Mudong, combines dramatic performance, music, dance, and spirit possession in a theatrical display that can last for many hours or even days. The Korean shamanic worldview divides the cosmos into three realms: the celestial realm of heavenly deities, the earthly realm of humans and nature spirits, and the underworld of the dead. The Mudong navigates between these realms, ascending to petition heavenly powers, communicating with earthly spirits, and descending to guide the souls of the deceased to their proper resting place. This cosmological structure, while sharing basic features with shamanic traditions worldwide, developed unique characteristics shaped by Korean geography, history, and cultural values. The initiation of Korean shamans typically follows one of two patterns. Hereditary shamans, known as Tango Mudong, inherit their role through family lineage, learning ritual techniques from their mothers or grandmothers in an unbroken chain of transmission. Charismatic shamans, called Kangsin Mudong, receive their calling through a spiritual crisis known as Sinbyung, or spirit sickness. This affliction, characterized by physical illness, psychological disturbance, and supernatural experiences, can only be resolved by accepting the spirit's call and undergoing initiation as a shaman. The Sinbyung experience bears remarkable similarities to shamanic initiatory illness found in cultures worldwide, suggesting either common psychological mechanisms underlying shamanic vocation or ancient historical connections between traditions. The suffering of the initiate, their symbolic death and rebirth, and their emergence with new spiritual powers follow a pattern that transcends cultural boundaries while manifesting in culturally specific forms. Japanese shamanism presents a complex picture of indigenous practices overlaid with continental influences and transformed by the development of organized religion. The earliest Japanese shamanic traditions centered on the Miko, female spirit mediums who served as oracles and performed rituals of purification and healing. These ancient practices became incorporated into Shinto, the indigenous Japanese religion, where Miko continue to serve at shrines, though their role has become largely ceremonial in mainstream contexts. The Itako of northern Japan represent a survival of more traditional shamanic practices. These blind female mediums specialize in communicating with the spirits of the dead, performing rituals called kuchiyose, in which they allow deceased souls to speak through them. The training of Itako involves years of ascetic practice, memorization of sacred texts, and gradual development of mediumistic abilities. Their blindness, whether congenital or acquired, is considered a mark of spiritual election, their physical darkness opening them to spiritual light. The Yamabushi, mountain ascetics associated with the syncretic tradition of Shugendo, preserve shamanic elements within a framework that combines Buddhist, Taoist, and Shinto influences. Their practices of mountain pilgrimage, waterfall meditation, fire rituals, and extreme asceticism aim at acquiring spiritual power through direct encounter with the sacred forces dwelling in Japan's mountainous landscape. The Yamabushi's role as healers, exorcists, and ritual specialists connects them to shamanic functions. though their institutional organization and doctrinal elaboration distinguish them from classical shamanism. The interaction between shamanic traditions and organized religions in East Asia created complex patterns of accommodation, competition, and synthesis. Buddhism, arriving from India through Central Asia and China, brought sophisticated philosophical systems and institutional structures that both challenged and absorbed local shamanic practices. Buddhist monks often served functions similar to shamans, performing rituals for the dead, exorcising malevolent spirits, and providing spiritual healing. Yet Buddhism also condemned certain shamanic practices as superstitious or demonic, creating tensions that continue to shape religious life in East Asian societies. Confucianism, with its emphasis on rational ethics and social harmony, generally viewed shamanic practices with suspicion, associating them with ignorance and social disorder. Confucian scholars repeatedly attempted to suppress shamanic activities, particularly those involving ecstatic possession and communication with spirits. Yet shamanism persisted at the popular level, serving needs that Confucian rationalism could not address. The relationship between elite Confucian culture and popular shamanic practice created a dynamic tension that characterized East Asian religious history for centuries. The modern fate of East Asian shamanism reflects broader patterns of modernization, secularization, and cultural revival. In China, shamanic practices were severely suppressed during the Cultural Revolution, condemned as feudal superstition incompatible with socialist modernity. Yet shamanism has experienced a remarkable revival in recent decades, particularly among minority nationalities, whose shamanic traditions are now celebrated as valuable cultural heritage. The Chinese government's shifting attitude toward shamanism reflects changing ideological priorities and growing recognition of shamanism's role in ethnic identity and cultural tourism. Korean shamanism has shown remarkable resilience, surviving Japanese colonial suppression, Christian missionary opposition, and modernizing government's attempts at eradication. Today, Mudong continue to practice throughout South Korea, serving clients who seek healing, fortune-telling, and ritual services. Korean shamanism has also gained recognition as intangible cultural heritage, with master shamans designated as living national treasures. This official recognition, while providing protection and prestige, also raises questions about the authenticity of shamanic practice when it becomes a subject of cultural preservation and tourist spectacle. When human beings first crossed from Asia into the Americas, perhaps 20,000 years ago or more, they carried with them the seeds of shamanic traditions that would flower into extraordinary diversity across two vast continents. From the frozen tundra of Alaska to the windswept tip of Tierra del Fuego, from dense Amazonian rainforests to arid southwestern deserts, shamanic practices developed in response to vastly different environments while maintaining recognizable connections to their Asian origins. The shamanism of Arctic and subarctic North America shows the clearest continuities with Siberian traditions, reflecting both geographical proximity and relatively recent migration. The Inuit Ungakuk, like their Siberian counterparts, undertook spirit journeys to the undersea realm of Sedna, the goddess who controlled the sea mammals upon which Inuit survival depended. When hunting failed, the Ungakuk would enter trance, descend through the layers of the cosmos, and negotiate with Sedna to release the animals. These negotiations often required the shaman to comb Sedna's tangled hair, matted by human transgressions, a ritual act of purification that restored the proper relationship between humans and the natural world. The Inuit shamanic worldview conceived of a universe populated by innumerable spirits inhabiting every aspect of the environment. Animals possessed souls that required respectful treatment. Improper behavior toward hunted animals could offend their spirits and cause them to withhold themselves from hunters. The Angakuk served as the specialist in maintaining proper relationships with these spirits, diagnosing the spiritual causes of misfortune, and performing the rituals necessary to restore cosmic harmony. Moving southward into the forests and plains of North America, shamanic traditions diversified in response to different ecological and cultural conditions. The vision quest, a practice of solitary fasting and prayer undertaken to obtain spiritual power and guidance, became a central institution among many Native American peoples. Young men, and sometimes women, would retreat to isolated locations, abstaining from food and water while praying for a vision. The spirits who appeared in these visions became the individual's personal guardians, sources of power and protection throughout life. The vision quest democratized access to spiritual power, allowing individuals to establish direct relationships with the spirit world without shamanic intermediaries. Yet specialized shamans remained important, their greater power and knowledge enabling them to perform functions beyond ordinary individuals' capabilities. The relationship between personal vision experience and specialized shamanic practice varied among different peoples, creating diverse configurations of spiritual authority and practice. The sweat lodge ceremony, found throughout much of North America, combined physical purification with spiritual transformation in a ritual that continues to be practiced today. Participants entered a small, enclosed structure heated by stones that had been fired in a sacred fire. Water poured over the stones created intense steam, inducing profuse sweating and altered states of consciousness. Prayers, songs, and sometimes visions accompanied the physical ordeal, creating an experience of death and rebirth that prepared participants for spiritual encounters. The sun dance of the Plains peoples represented one of the most elaborate and demanding shamanic rituals in North America. This annual ceremony, lasting several days, involved fasting, dancing, and for some participants, piercing of the flesh and suspension from a central pole. The suffering endured during the Sundance was offered as sacrifice for the benefit of the community, the dancers' ordeal ensuring the renewal of the world and the continuation of life. The Sundance was banned by colonial authorities who viewed it as barbaric, but it has been revived and continues to be practiced as a central expression of Plains Indian spirituality. The indigenous peoples of Mexico and Central America developed shamanic traditions of extraordinary sophistication, incorporating the use of psychoactive plants into complex ritual systems. The Aztec Tlamatini, knowers of things, combined shamanic functions with priestly roles in a religious system that included human sacrifice on a massive scale. Yet alongside these state-sponsored rituals, village-level shamans continued to practice healing, divination, and spirit communication, using techniques that predated Aztec imperial religion. The use of psilocybin mushrooms, known to the Aztecs as Teonanacatl, flesh of the gods, provided access to visionary states in which practitioners encountered divine beings and received sacred knowledge. Morning glory seeds called ololiuki and the peyote cactus serve similar functions, their psychoactive properties understood not as chemical effects, but as the presence of divine spirits within the plants themselves. These plant teachers, as they are often called, were approached with reverence and ritual preparation, their use embedded in cultural frameworks that shaped and interpreted the experiences they induced. The Maya civilization, flourishing in the tropical lowlands of Mexico and Central America, developed shamanic practices integrated with a complex calendrical system and elaborate mythology. Maya shamans, known as Hemen in Yucatec Maya, served as healers, diviners, and ritual specialists who maintained communication with ancestors and deities. The Maya conceived of the cosmos as structured around a great world tree, the axis mundi connecting the celestial realm, the earthly plane, and the watery underworld of Xibalba. Shamanic journeys followed this cosmic axis, ascending to commune with celestial powers or descending to negotiate with the lords of death. Bloodletting rituals played a central role in Maya shamanic practice, the offering of one's own blood serving to open portals to the spirit world and nourish the gods. Royal Maya shamans, including kings and queens, performed elaborate bloodletting ceremonies in which they pierced their tongues, earlobes, or genitals with obsidian blades or stingray spines. The blood was collected on paper and burned, the rising smoke carrying prayers to the heavens, while the pain and blood loss induced visionary states in which ancestors and deities appeared. South American shamanism reached perhaps its fullest development in the Amazon basin, where the extraordinary biodiversity of the tropical rainforest provided shamans with an unparalleled pharmacopoeia of psychoactive and medicinal plants. The ayahuasca brew, combining the Banisteriopsis caapi vine with leaves containing DMT, became the central sacrament of Amazonian shamanism, inducing powerful visionary experiences in which practitioners encountered spirits, traveled to other realms, and gained knowledge for healing and divination. The preparation and consumption of ayahuasca is embedded in elaborate ritual contexts that shape and interpret the experiences it induces. Shamans undergo years of training, learning to navigate the visionary landscapes, communicate with plant spirits, and use the knowledge gained for healing. The ayahuasca experience is often described as encountering the spirits of the plants themselves, who teach the shaman their healing properties and proper uses. This direct transmission of knowledge from plant teachers represents a distinctive feature of Amazonian shamanism, one that has attracted considerable interest from Western researchers and spiritual seekers. The diversity of Amazonian shamanic traditions reflects the cultural diversity of the region's indigenous peoples. Different groups developed distinctive practices, mythologies, and relationships with the spirit world, though certain common themes recur. The conception of illness as caused by spiritual intrusion or soul loss, the shaman's role in extracting harmful objects or retrieving lost souls, the importance of songs and music in shamanic practice, and the use of tobacco as a sacred plant appear throughout the region, suggesting both common origins and ongoing cultural exchange. The Andean highlands of South America developed shamanic traditions adapted to the challenging environment of high-altitude mountains and plateaus. The Paco of the Quechua and Aymara peoples serve as ritual specialists who maintain relationships with the APUs, the mountain spirits dwelling in the peaks that dominate the Andean landscape. These mountain spirits, conceived as powerful and sometimes dangerous beings, must be propitiated with offerings to ensure good harvests, healthy livestock, and community well-being. Coca leaves, chewed throughout the Andes for millennia, play a central role in Andean shamanic practice. The coca plant is considered a sacred being, its leaves used for divination, offerings, and communication with spirits. The reading of coca leaves, in which a shaman interprets the patterns formed by leaves cast upon a cloth, provides guidance on matters ranging from health concerns to agricultural decisions. This practice continues today, coca remaining central to Andean indigenous culture, despite its controversial status due to its role in cocaine production. The African continent, birthplace of humanity itself, harbors shamanic traditions of immense antiquity and diversity, from the San peoples of the Kalahari, whose rock art may preserve the oldest visual records of shamanic experience, to the elaborate possession cults of West Africa, the continent presents a rich tapestry of practices for engaging with the spirit world. Yet African traditions have often been overlooked or misrepresented in discussions of shamanism, their distinctive features obscured by frameworks developed primarily from Siberian and American examples. The San peoples of southern Africa, formerly known by the derogatory term Bushmen, maintain shamanic traditions that may represent the oldest continuous spiritual practices on Earth. San rock art, found throughout southern Africa and dating back thousands of years, depicts scenes that scholars interpret as representing shamanic experiences. Figures in trance postures, therianthropic beings combining human and animal features, and geometric patterns resembling the entoptic phenomena seen during altered states of consciousness. The San healing dance, still practiced today, provides a living context for understanding these ancient images. During all-night ceremonies, healers dance around a fire while women clap and sing, the rhythmic stimulation gradually inducing altered states of consciousness. As the trance deepens, healers experience the activation of Norom, a spiritual energy believed to reside in the belly. This energy rises up the spine, causing intense physical sensations and enabling the healer to perceive and extract illness from patients. The San conception of the spirit world centers on the relationship between humans and animals, particularly the large game animals upon which San survival traditionally depended. During trance, healers may transform into animals, experiencing the world from an animal's perspective and gaining access to animal powers. The eland, largest of the African antelopes, holds particular spiritual significance, its fat believed to be saturated with N or OM. The intimate knowledge of animal behavior that San hunters possess becomes, in the shamanic context, a form of spiritual communion with animal spirits. West African religious traditions developed elaborate systems of spirit possession that differ in significant ways from the classic shamanic pattern of controlled spirit journeying. In possession religions such as Vodun, Santeria, and Candomblé, practitioners do not journey to the spirit world but rather invite spirits to descend and temporarily inhabit their bodies. During possession, the human personality is displaced, the spirit speaking and acting through the possessed individual's body. The Orishas of Yoruba religion, carried to the Americas through the slave trade, and there syncretized with Catholic saints, represent a pantheon of divine beings who regularly possess their devotees during ritual ceremonies. Each Orisha has distinctive characteristics, preferences, and powers. Shango, the thunder god, is fierce and proud. Oshun, goddess of sweet waters, is sensual and generous. Ogun, lord of iron and war, is powerful and dangerous. When an Orisha possesses a devotee, the person's behavior transforms to reflect the deity's personality, their movements, speech, and demeanor becoming those of the god. The relationship between devotee and Orisha develops over a lifetime, beginning with divination to determine which Orisha claims the individual as their child. Initiation ceremonies establish formal bonds between human and deity, the initiate undergoing rituals that prepare their body to receive the Orisha's presence. The possessed state, far from being viewed as pathological, is considered a great honor, the Orisha's presence bringing blessings to the individual and community. The distinction between shamanic journeying and spirit possession has led some scholars to question whether African traditions should be classified as shamanic at all. Yet this distinction may be overdrawn, reflecting the particular historical development of shamanic studies rather than fundamental differences in spiritual practice. Many African traditions include elements of both possession and journeying, and the underlying purpose of communicating with spirits for healing and guidance remains constant. The Sangoma tradition of southern Africa illustrates the complexity of African shamanic practices. Sangomas serve as diviners, healers, and ritual specialists who communicate with ancestral spirits to diagnose illness and prescribe treatment. Their calling typically comes through a spiritual crisis called ukuthwasa, characterized by illness, dreams, and visions that can only be resolved by accepting the ancestors' call and undergoing training. This initiatory pattern closely parallels shamanic calling in other traditions, suggesting underlying similarities despite surface differences. Sangoma training involves learning to interpret dreams and visions, mastering the use of divination tools such as bones and shells, and developing relationships with ancestral spirits who guide the healer's work. The training period, lasting several years, culminates in graduation ceremonies that publicly acknowledge the new Sangoma's abilities and authorize their practice. The Sangoma's ongoing relationship with ancestral spirits provides the foundation for their healing work, the ancestors revealing the causes of illness and appropriate treatments. The concept of ancestral spirits plays a central role in African religious thought, the dead remaining actively involved in the lives of their descendants. Ancestors must be honored with offerings and rituals. Neglect of ancestral obligations can result in illness, misfortune, and social discord. The shaman or ritual specialist serves as the primary intermediary between the living and the dead, conveying messages in both directions and maintaining the proper relationships that ensure community well-being. The Zar cult, found throughout northeastern Africa and the Middle East, represents another form of spirit possession tradition, with therapeutic functions. Zar spirits, conceived as a separate race of beings that can afflict humans, cause illness and psychological disturbance in those they possess. Rather than exorcising these spirits, Zar practitioners seek to negotiate with them, establishing ongoing relationships that transform affliction into alliance. Regular ceremonies honor the possessing spirits, their demands for specific foods, colors, and behaviors becoming part of the possessed person's ongoing religious practice. The therapeutic effectiveness of Zar and similar possession cults has attracted considerable attention from medical anthropologists. The rituals provide social support, meaningful explanation for suffering, and opportunities for emotional expression within culturally sanctioned frameworks. The transformation of affliction into religious vocation, the sufferer becoming a healer, parallels the shamanic pattern of initiatory illness followed by healing power. Central African traditions include the Bwiti religion of Gabon, which centers on the use of iboga, a powerful psychoactive plant that induces prolonged visionary experiences. Bwiti initiates consume large doses of iboga root bark, entering a state that can last for days and involves encounters with ancestors, spirits, and the fundamental forces of existence. The iboga experience is understood as a journey to the land of the dead, where initiates meet deceased relatives and receive teachings about the nature of reality. The intensity of the iboga experience, which can include realistic visions of deceased family members and profound insights into one's life, has attracted interest from Western researchers investigating its potential for treating addiction and psychological disorders. Yet the Bwiti context emphasizes that iboga's power comes not merely from its chemical properties, but from its status as a sacred plant inhabited by spirits who choose to teach those who approach with proper respect and preparation. The vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, scattered with islands ranging from tiny atolls to the continent of Australia, harbors shamanic traditions shaped by maritime environments and the challenges of island life. The peoples who colonized this oceanic realm, spreading from Southeast Asia across thousands of miles of open water, carried spiritual traditions that adapted to new environments while maintaining connections to ancestral homelands. Australian Aboriginal spirituality, developing in isolation for perhaps 60,000 years, represents one of humanity's oldest continuous religious traditions. The concept of the dreamtime, or dreaming, provides the foundation for Aboriginal understanding of reality, describing both the primordial era, when ancestral beings shaped the world, and the ongoing spiritual dimension that underlies everyday existence. The dreamtime is not merely the past, but an eternal present, accessible through ritual, song, and altered states of consciousness. Aboriginal clever men and women, known by various names in different language groups, serve shamanic functions of healing, divination, and communication with the spirit world. Their powers derive from relationships with ancestral beings and mastery of spiritual forces that permeate the landscape. The Australian continent itself is conceived as a sacred text, every feature of the land created by and embodying ancestral beings whose travels during the dreamtime establish the patterns of existence. The songlines or dreaming tracks that crisscross Australia represent the paths traveled by ancestral beings, their journeys encoded in songs that simultaneously describe the landscape and narrate mythological events. Those who know the songs can travel across the country, the verses serving as maps that guide them from waterhole to waterhole while connecting them to the spiritual power of the ancestors. The singing of these songs is itself a ritual act, maintaining the world created by the ancestors and renewing the bonds between humans, land, and spirit. Aboriginal healing practices involve the manipulation of spiritual forces understood to permeate all existence. Illness may result from sorcery, violation of sacred law, or intrusion of harmful spiritual substances. The healer diagnoses the cause through divination and dreams, then applies appropriate treatments that may include extraction of harmful objects, restoration of spiritual balance, and ritual actions to counteract sorcery. The healer's power derives from their relationship with ancestral beings and their knowledge of the spiritual forces that animate the world. The initiation of Aboriginal shamans involves encounters with powerful spirits who may kill and reconstitute the initiate, inserting magical substances into their body that provide healing power. These initiatory experiences, occurring in dreams, visions, or ritual contexts, transform ordinary individuals into specialists capable of perceiving and manipulating spiritual realities invisible to others. The inserted substances, often described as quartz crystals, become the source of the shaman's power, enabling them to see illness, extract harmful intrusions, and perform other healing acts. Polynesian traditions, developing as voyaging peoples spread across the Pacific, share certain features while adapting to diverse island environments. The concept of mana, spiritual power that can be accumulated, transferred, and lost, provides a framework for understanding the distribution of sacred force in the world. Chiefs, priests, and other high-status individuals possess great mana, their power requiring careful management through systems of taboo, that regulate contact with sacred persons and objects. The kahuna of Hawaii, whose title means keeper of the secret, served as priests, healers, and specialists in various arts and crafts. Different types of kahuna specialized in different domains. Kahuna Lapa'au practiced herbal medicine and healing. Kahuna Ana wielded sorcery. Kahuna Pule served as prayer specialists. The training of kahuna involved years of apprenticeship, memorization of chants and genealogies, and gradual acquisition of the spiritual power necessary for their work. Hawaiian shamanic practice included communication with Amakua, ancestral spirits who served as family guardians and sources of guidance. These ancestors, often associated with particular animals, such as sharks, owls, or lizards, could be consulted through dreams, divination, and ritual. The relationship between living descendants and ancestral Amakua formed a continuous chain linking the present to the mythological past. The accumulated wisdom of generations available to those who maintained proper relationships with their ancestors. The Tohunga of New Zealand Maori served similar functions, their title indicating expertise in particular domains of knowledge and practice. Tohunga Wakairo were master carvers. Tohunga Tomoko specialized in tattooing. Tohunga Ahurewa served as high priests. The Tohunga's knowledge was considered tapu, sacred and dangerous, requiring careful transmission through proper channels to avoid spiritual harm. Maori conceptions of the spirit world included multiple realms inhabited by gods, ancestors, and other spiritual beings. The Wairua, or spirit, could leave the body during sleep or illness, traveling to spirit realms or visiting distant places. Death involved the spirit's journey to the underworld, guided by ancestral spirits along paths established in mythological time. The Tohunga's role included facilitating these spiritual journeys, ensuring proper passage of the dead, and maintaining communication between the living and their ancestors. Melanesian traditions, found in New Guinea and the island chain stretching toward Fiji, developed distinctive forms of shamanic practice, adapted to the region's extraordinary cultural and linguistic diversity. The big man system of leadership, in which individuals achieved status through accumulation and redistribution of wealth, intersected with spiritual power in complex ways. Successful leaders often attributed their achievements to relationships with spirits, their political and economic success demonstrating spiritual favor. The cargo cults that emerged in Melanesia following contact with Western colonial powers represent a distinctive response to the disruption of traditional spiritual systems. These movements, which anticipated the arrival of material goods through ritual means, combined traditional beliefs about ancestral spirits with new understandings of Western wealth and power. While often dismissed as irrational responses to colonialism, cargo cults can be understood as creative attempts to make sense of radically changed circumstances using available cultural resources. Across the vast diversity of shamanic traditions, certain patterns recur with remarkable consistency, suggesting either common origins in humanity's distant past or universal features of human consciousness and social organization. The three-tiered cosmos, the world tree, or axis mundi, the initiatory death and rebirth, the spirit journey, and the healing extraction of harmful intrusions, appear in traditions separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Understanding these patterns illuminates both the unity underlying shamanic diversity and the creative variations through which different cultures have elaborated common themes. The shamanic cosmos typically comprises three realms: an upper world associated with celestial powers, light and benevolent spirits, a middle world corresponding to ordinary reality and inhabited by humans, animals, and nature spirits, and a lower world associated with the dead, chthonic powers, and sometimes dangerous or ambivalent beings. These realms are connected by a central axis, often conceived as a world tree whose roots reach into the underworld, whose trunk passes through the middle world, and whose branches extend into the heavens. This cosmic geography provides the framework for shamanic journeying, the practitioner ascending or descending along the world axis to reach the realm appropriate to their purpose. Journeys to the upper world might seek knowledge from celestial spirits, petition sky gods for community welfare, or retrieve souls that have wandered upward. Descents to the lower world often involve retrieving souls of the sick that have been captured by spirits of the dead, negotiating with underworld powers, or guiding the deceased to their proper resting place. The world tree appears in traditions worldwide, from the Yggdrasil of Norse mythology to the Seba of Maya cosmology. from the birch trees of Siberian shamans to the cosmic pillars of Australian Aboriginal thought. This image seems to arise naturally from human experience of trees as connectors of earth and sky, their roots hidden in darkness while their branches reach toward the light. The shaman's drum, often made from wood of the world tree, becomes a vehicle for cosmic travel, its rhythms carrying the practitioner between realms. The initiatory death and rebirth of the shaman represents another universal pattern. The future shaman undergoing a transformative crisis that destroys their ordinary identity and reconstitutes them as a being capable of moving between worlds. This death may be experienced in visions, dreams, or severe illness. It may involve dismemberment by spirits, consumption by animals, or descent to the realm of the dead. The reconstitution that follows typically includes the insertion of new spiritual substances, the acquisition of spirit helpers, and the gaining of powers unavailable to ordinary humans. This initiatory pattern reflects a profound psychological and spiritual truth. Genuine transformation requires the death of the old self before the new self can emerge. The shaman's initiatory crisis, however terrifying, ultimately leads to enhanced capabilities and social recognition. The suffering is not meaningless but generative, producing the healer who can guide others through their own crises. This understanding of transformation through ordeal appears not only in shamanic traditions, but in mystery religions, monastic practices, and modern psychotherapy. The spirit helpers who assist the shaman in their work represent another universal feature of shamanic traditions. These beings, acquired during initiation or subsequent spiritual experiences, provide the shaman with power, knowledge, and protection. Animal spirits are particularly common, their specific forms reflecting local fauna and cultural values. The bear, eagle, wolf, jaguar, and serpent appear as spirit helpers across different traditions, their natural characteristics translated into spiritual powers. The relationship between shaman and spirit helper is typically conceived as one of alliance rather than domination. The spirits choose to assist the shaman, their cooperation earned through proper behavior, offerings, and maintenance of relationship. This reciprocal understanding reflects broader shamanic conceptions of human-spirit relations, in which spirits are not mere tools to be commanded, but persons to be respected and cultivated. The healing practices of shamans worldwide share common features despite surface variations. Illness is typically understood as having spiritual causes: intrusion of harmful objects or spirits, loss of the soul, violation of taboos, or sorcery by enemies. Diagnosis involves determining which of these causes applies, often through divination, dreams, or direct spiritual perception. Treatment addresses the spiritual cause, the shaman extracting intrusions, retrieving lost souls, counteracting sorcery, or performing rituals to restore proper relationships with offended spirits. The extraction of illness, in which the shaman removes a harmful object from the patient's body, appears in traditions worldwide. The shaman may suck the intrusion from the patient's body, pull it out with their hands, or use ritual implements to capture and remove it. The extracted object, often displayed to patient and observers, may appear as a stone, insect, or other small item. Skeptical observers have sometimes dismissed these extractions as sleight of hand, but their therapeutic effectiveness suggests that the ritual's meaning and social context matter more than the literal reality of the extracted object. Soul retrieval, the recovery of a patient's soul that has wandered or been captured, represents another widespread healing practice. The shaman journeys to the realm where the soul is held, negotiates or battles for its release, and returns it to the patient's body. The soul's absence explains the patient's symptoms: listlessness, depression, loss of vitality, or susceptibility to illness. Its return restores wholeness and health, the patient's life force renewed by the shaman's successful journey. The role of music and rhythm in shamanic practice appears universally, though the specific instruments and musical forms vary. The drum, rattle, and voice provide the sonic foundation for shamanic work, their rhythms inducing altered states of consciousness and calling spirits to attend. The shaman's songs, often received from spirits during initiation or subsequent visions, carry power in themselves, their words and melodies capable of affecting spiritual realities. Research into the neurological effects of rhythmic drumming has confirmed what shamans have long known. Sustained rhythmic stimulation can induce altered states of consciousness characterized by vivid imagery, feelings of transportation, and access to normally unconscious mental contents. The specific frequency of shamanic drumming, typically around 4 to 7 beats per second, corresponds to theta wave activity in the brain, associated with drowsiness, meditation, and the hypnagogic state between waking and sleep. The history of shamanism over the past several centuries is largely a history of persecution, suppression, and survival against overwhelming odds. Colonial expansion, missionary activity, and modernizing states have repeatedly attempted to eliminate shamanic practices, viewing them as obstacles to religious conversion, political control, or economic development. Yet shamanism has shown remarkable resilience, adapting to changed circumstances, going underground when necessary, and re-emerging when conditions permit. The Russian conquest of Siberia, beginning in the 16th century, brought Orthodox Christianity and state power to the homeland of classical shamanism. Missionaries condemned shamanic practices as devil worship, while colonial administrators saw shamans as obstacles to the extraction of tribute and resources. Shamanic drums were confiscated and burned. Shamans were imprisoned or executed, and indigenous peoples were pressured to abandon their traditional practices and accept baptism. Yet Siberian shamanism survived, adapting to the new religious landscape through various strategies. Some shamans incorporated Christian elements into their practice, adding saints to their pantheon of spirits and using Christian prayers alongside traditional invocations. Others practiced in secret, maintaining traditions hidden from authorities while outwardly conforming to orthodox requirements. The vast distances and sparse population of Siberia made complete suppression impossible, allowing shamanic traditions to persist in remote areas. The Soviet period brought new and more systematic persecution. Marxist ideology condemned religion as the opium of the people, and shamanism, with its claims of spirit communication and magical healing, was particularly targeted as superstitious backwardness, incompatible with socialist modernity. Shamans were classified as class enemies, their practices criminalized, and many were sent to labor camps or executed. The campaign against shamanism was part of broader efforts to transform indigenous peoples into Soviet citizens, replacing traditional cultures with socialist values and practices. The destruction was extensive, but not complete. Some shamans continued to practice in secret, their activities hidden from authorities. Others adapted their practices, presenting healing work as folk medicine rather than spiritual intervention. The knowledge of shamanic traditions was preserved in families, passed down quietly from generation to generation, even when public practice was impossible. When the Soviet Union collapsed, this preserved knowledge provided the foundation for shamanic revival. The colonization of the Americas brought similar patterns of persecution and survival. Spanish conquistadors and missionaries viewed indigenous spiritual practices as devil worship requiring immediate eradication. Shamans were particular targets, their influence over indigenous communities threatening both religious conversion and political control. The Inquisition prosecuted indigenous practitioners, and colonial laws prohibited traditional ceremonies and the use of sacred plants. Yet indigenous shamanism survived through various strategies of resistance and adaptation. Syncretism, the blending of indigenous and Christian elements, allowed traditional practices to continue under Catholic guise. The Virgin of Guadalupe, appearing to an indigenous convert on the site of an Aztec goddess's shrine, became a powerful symbol of this synthesis, her veneration incorporating indigenous spiritual sensibilities within a Christian framework. Shamanic practices continued in remote areas beyond effective colonial control, and even in areas of intensive missionization, traditional knowledge was preserved and transmitted. The peyote religion of North America illustrates both the persecution of indigenous spirituality and its remarkable survival. The use of peyote, a psychoactive cactus, in religious ceremonies was repeatedly banned by colonial and later American authorities. Yet practitioners persisted, eventually organizing as the Native American Church, which successfully claimed First Amendment protection for peyote use in religious contexts. This legal recognition, achieved only after decades of struggle, demonstrates both the determination of indigenous practitioners and the possibilities for shamanic survival within modern legal frameworks. The persecution of shamanism in East Asia followed different patterns but achieved similar results of suppression without complete elimination. In China, successive dynasties attempted to control or eliminate shamanic practices, viewing them as threats to social order and Confucian values. The Communist Revolution brought intensified persecution, shamanism condemned as feudal superstition incompatible with scientific socialism. The Cultural Revolution's assault on traditional culture devastated shamanic traditions, practitioners persecuted and sacred objects destroyed. Yet Chinese shamanism has experienced remarkable revival in recent decades. The relaxation of religious restrictions, combined with growing interest in traditional culture, has allowed shamanic practices to re-emerge. Among minority nationalities, shamanism is now often celebrated as valuable cultural heritage, shamans performing at festivals and for tourists. This official recognition, while providing protection, also raises questions about authenticity when shamanic practice becomes cultural performance. Korean shamanism survived Japanese colonial suppression, Christian missionary opposition, and modernizing government's attempts at eradication. The Mudang continued to practice throughout the 20th century, serving clients who sought their services despite official disapproval. Today, Korean shamanism has achieved recognition as intangible cultural heritage, master shamans designated as living national treasures. This transformation from persecuted superstition to protected heritage reflects broader changes in attitudes toward traditional culture. The African diaspora, created by the slave trade, carried shamanic traditions across the Atlantic, where they survived and transformed under conditions of extreme oppression. Enslaved Africans, forbidden to practice their religions, developed syncretic traditions that preserved African spiritual content within Catholic forms. The Orishas became identified with Catholic saints. African drumming and possession rituals continued under the guise of Saints' Day celebrations, and shamanic healing practices persisted despite prohibition. These Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Brazilian traditions, including Vodou, Santeria, and Candomblé, represent remarkable examples of cultural survival and creativity. Developed under conditions of slavery and continued persecution, they maintained connections to African spiritual traditions while adapting to New World circumstances. Today, these traditions have millions of practitioners and have spread far beyond their Caribbean and Brazilian origins. Their resilience, demonstrating the enduring human need for direct engagement with spiritual realities. The late 20th century witnessed an unexpected development, the revival of interest in shamanism among Western populations who had long dismissed such practices as primitive superstition. This neo-shamanic movement, drawing on anthropological research, indigenous teachings, and personal experimentation, has made shamanic practices available to millions of people worldwide. Yet this revival raises complex questions about authenticity, appropriation, and the relationship between traditional and modern forms of spiritual practice. The publication of Carlos Castaneda's The Teachings of Don Juan in 1968 marked a turning point in Western awareness of shamanism. Castaneda's accounts of his apprenticeship with a Yaqui sorcerer, whether factual or fictional, captured the imagination of a generation seeking alternatives to mainstream Western spirituality. The book's enormous popularity demonstrated widespread hunger for direct spiritual experience and dissatisfaction with conventional religious institutions. Michael Harner, an anthropologist who had studied with indigenous shamans in South America, developed what he called core shamanism, a system of practices stripped of specific cultural content and presented as universal techniques accessible to anyone. Harner's Foundation for Shamanic Studies has trained thousands of practitioners in shamanic journeying, offering workshops and certification programs that have spread shamanic techniques throughout the Western world. The core shamanism approach has been both celebrated and criticized. Supporters argue that it makes valuable spiritual practices available to people who would otherwise have no access to them, and that the underlying techniques are indeed universal, belonging to no single culture. Critics contend that removing shamanic practices from their cultural contexts strips them of meaning and power, reducing profound spiritual traditions to self-help techniques. Indigenous practitioners have sometimes objected to what they see as appropriation of their sacred traditions by outsiders who lack proper training and authorization. The ayahuasca tourism phenomenon illustrates both the appeal and the problems of modern shamanic revival. Thousands of Westerners travel annually to Peru and other Amazonian countries to participate in ayahuasca ceremonies, seeking healing, spiritual insight, or transformative experiences. This influx has created economic opportunities for indigenous communities, while also raising concerns about commercialization, safety, and cultural impact. The traditional context of ayahuasca use involved years of training, dietary restrictions, and gradual development of relationships with plant spirits. Tourist ceremonies, lasting a few days or weeks, cannot replicate this depth of preparation. Yet many participants report profound and beneficial experiences, suggesting that ayahuasca's power does not depend entirely on traditional context. The challenge lies in developing forms of practice that honor indigenous knowledge while adapting to modern circumstances. The legal status of psychoactive plants used in shamanic practice remains contested in many countries. Ayahuasca, peyote, psilocybin mushrooms, and other traditional sacraments are controlled substances under most national laws, their use prohibited regardless of religious context. Yet religious freedom arguments have achieved some legal recognition, particularly for established churches with documented histories of sacramental use. The expansion of these protections to new practitioners and contexts remains an ongoing legal and political struggle. The therapeutic potential of shamanic practices has attracted increasing attention from mental health professionals. Research on psychedelic-assisted therapy has shown promising results for conditions including depression, anxiety, addiction, and post-traumatic stress disorder. While these clinical applications differ from traditional shamanic healing, they share the recognition that altered states of consciousness can facilitate profound psychological transformation. The concept of shamanic counseling has emerged as practitioners attempt to integrate shamanic techniques with modern therapeutic approaches. This integration raises questions about training, ethics, and the relationship between spiritual and psychological frameworks. Some practitioners maintain clear boundaries between shamanic and therapeutic work. Others see them as complementary aspects of a holistic approach to healing. The environmental dimensions of shamanic revival reflect growing awareness of ecological crisis and the search for alternative relationships with the natural world. Traditional shamanic worldviews, which conceive of nature as alive with spirits deserving respect and reciprocity, offer alternatives to the instrumental attitudes toward nature that have driven environmental destruction. The shamanic understanding of humans as participants in a community of beings rather than masters of a world of objects resonates with ecological thinking and deep ecology philosophy. Indigenous shamanic practitioners have increasingly engaged with environmental activism, their traditional knowledge and spiritual authority lending weight to efforts to protect threatened ecosystems. The defense of the Amazon rainforest, for example, has involved alliances between indigenous communities, environmental organizations, and supporters worldwide, with shamanic leaders playing prominent roles. This engagement brings traditional shamanism into dialogue with global movements, while raising questions about the political dimensions of spiritual practice. The internet and social media have transformed the landscape of shamanic practice, enabling connections between practitioners worldwide, while also facilitating the spread of misinformation and exploitation. Online communities share experiences, techniques, and resources. Virtual ceremonies attempt to create shared sacred space across physical distances, and debates about authenticity and appropriation play out in digital forums. The implications of these technological mediations for shamanic practice remain unclear, the ancient techniques encountering unprecedented conditions. As we conclude this exploration of shamanism across time and space, we find ourselves confronting fundamental questions about human consciousness, spiritual experience, and the future of our species. Shamanism, humanity's oldest spiritual tradition, has survived ice ages and empires, persecution and modernization. Its persistence suggests that it addresses enduring human needs that cannot be met by other means. Understanding what those needs are and how they might be addressed in contemporary contexts may be essential for navigating the challenges that lie ahead. The shamanic worldview rests on premises radically different from those of modern Western thought, where scientific materialism sees a universe of dead matter governed by mechanical laws. Shamanism perceives a cosmos alive with consciousness, populated by beings with whom humans can communicate and cooperate. Where modern individualism conceives of persons as separate selves contained within their skins, shamanism understands identity as fluid, permeable, and extended through relationships with other beings. Where contemporary culture often treats nature as a resource to be exploited, shamanism approaches the natural world as a community of persons deserving respect and reciprocity. These shamanic premises, long dismissed as primitive errors, have gained new relevance as the limitations of materialist worldviews become apparent. The ecological crisis, driven by attitudes that treat nature as mere raw material, demands new ways of relating to the more-than-human world. The epidemic of mental health problems in modern society suggests that something essential is missing from contemporary life. The hunger for meaning and connection that drives millions towards spiritual seeking indicates widespread dissatisfaction with purely secular existence. Shamanism offers not a return to a romanticized past, but resources for addressing present and future challenges. The shamanic understanding of consciousness as fundamental to reality rather than an accidental byproduct of brain activity, aligns with emerging perspectives in philosophy of mind and quantum physics. The shamanic practice of cultivating relationships with other than human beings provides models for the ecological consciousness our survival may require. The shamanic techniques for accessing non-ordinary states of consciousness offer tools for psychological healing and spiritual development. Yet the revival of shamanism in modern contexts faces significant challenges. The traditional shamanic role was embedded in small-scale societies where shamans served communities bound by kinship, shared territory, and common culture. Modern practitioners typically lack these social foundations, their practice often individualistic and disconnected from community accountability. The danger of spiritual narcissism, using shamanic techniques for personal gratification rather than service to others, is ever present in contemporary contexts. The question of authenticity haunts modern shamanic practice. Who has the right to call themselves a shaman? What training and authorization are necessary? How can traditional knowledge be respected while making it available to new practitioners? These questions have no easy answers, and the debates they generate reflect genuine tensions between preservation and adaptation, tradition and innovation, indigenous rights and universal access. The commercialization of shamanism presents another challenge. When shamanic practices become products to be marketed and consumed, something essential may be lost. The traditional shaman's authority derived from demonstrated power and community recognition, not from certificates or marketing. The reduction of shamanism to a commodity risks trivializing profound traditions while exploiting both indigenous knowledge holders and spiritual seekers. Despite these challenges, the shamanic revival continues to grow, suggesting that it addresses real needs that cannot be dismissed. The millions of people who have found healing, meaning, and transformation through shamanic practices testify to their continuing power. The indigenous communities that maintain traditional shamanism, despite centuries of persecution, demonstrate its enduring value. The researchers who study shamanic states of consciousness contribute to understanding of human potential. The future of shamanism likely lies not in simple preservation of traditional forms, nor in wholesale adoption of indigenous practices by outsiders, but in creative dialogue between traditions and contemporary needs. This dialogue requires respect for indigenous knowledge holders, recognition of the depth and sophistication of traditional practices, and humility about the limitations of modern understanding. It also requires willingness to experiment, to adapt ancient techniques to new circumstances, and to develop forms of practice appropriate to contemporary contexts. The shamanic journey, that ancient technique for exploring the geography of consciousness, remains available to those who seek it. The spirits that shamans have encountered across millennia continue to inhabit the imaginal realms accessible through altered states of consciousness. The healing power that shamans have wielded since the Paleolithic still flows through those who learn to channel it. The wisdom accumulated through countless generations of shamanic practice offers guidance for those who approach with respect and sincerity. As you drift toward sleep, carried by these words through the vast landscape of human spiritual experience, perhaps you sense the presence of those countless shamans who have gone before, their drums still echoing across time, their songs still resonating in the depths of consciousness. They journey to the edges of the known world and beyond, returning with gifts of healing and knowledge for their communities. Their legacy lives on, not as a relic of the past, but as a living tradition that continues to evolve and adapt. The shamanic path is not for everyone, but its existence enriches the possibilities available to all. In a world that often seems disenchanted, shamanism reminds us that enchantment remains possible, that the universe is more mysterious and alive than our ordinary consciousness perceives. In a time of ecological crisis, shamanism offers ways of relating to nature that honor its sacred dimension. In an age of spiritual seeking, shamanism provides techniques for direct experience of realities beyond the everyday. The drum beats on, as it has for tens of thousands of years. The shaman journeys, as shamans have journeyed since the dawn of human consciousness. The spirits wait, as they have always waited, for those who seek them with pure hearts and clear intentions. And the great mystery of existence, which shamanism has always served, continues to unfold, inviting us to participate in its endless becoming. Rest now, and let these ancient truths settle into your being. The journey continues, in dreams and waking life, in the depths of the forest and the heights of the mountain, in the silence of meditation and the ecstasy of the dance. Wherever consciousness explores its own nature, wherever humans seek healing and wholeness, wherever the boundary between worlds grows thin, the shamanic tradition lives on, an eternal flame passed from hand to hand across the generations, illuminating the path for all who follow.